Buddhist sleep story. A village welcomes the Buddha. Chapter 1. The road that comes to Bamboo Gate. There is a road in northern India that most maps have forgotten. It runs between a city called Savatthi and a stretch of forest nobody bothered to name. And if you followed it far enough, on a morning like any other, you would come to a cluster of huts pressed up against a stand of bamboo. The villagers called it Veludvara, the Bamboo Gate. It wasn't much of a gate, really, just two upright stones on either side of the path, worn smooth by generations of feet, marking the place where the village ended and the world began. Nobody remembered who set the stones there. Vadamata, the oldest woman in the village, used to say her grandmother's grandmother had known once and had never told anyone the reason. Which is the kind of thing old women say about old stones. You believe it or you don't. On the morning this story begins, the sky over Veludvara was the color of ash and had been for 3 months. The rains hadn't come. The fields, which should have been green by now, were the pale brown of things that are trying very hard not to die. If you walked the length of the village at dawn, which almost nobody did anymore except out of necessity, you would have heard a particular kind of quiet. Not peace, exactly, but the tired hush of a place holding its breath, waiting to see whether the sky would finally keep the promise it had been breaking for 3 months running. Sujata was already awake. She had been awake since before the birds, kneeling at the grinding stone outside her door, turning barley into something that could pass for flour, if you were hungry enough not to ask questions. Her hands knew the motion so well she could do it half asleep, which was useful, because she was half asleep. Her husband Nanda had been gone 11 days now, walking the trade road south with 2 other men, and whatever grain the village could spare to sell. And 11 days is a long time to be the only adult, in a house with 2 small children, and a field that isn't producing enough to feed them. The grinding stone had belonged to Nanda's mother before it belonged to Sujata, and to someone else's mother before that. A smooth, dark oval, worn into a shallow bowl shape by more hands than anyone could count. Sujata liked to imagine, sometimes in the grey hour before her children woke, that all those hands were somehow still there in the stone, grinding alongside hers, a long unbroken line of tired women, doing the same small necessary thing at the same grey hour, in every hard year the village had ever survived. It made the work feel less lonely, even if it didn't make it any lighter. Her son Tissa was 7, and had been a nervous child since a bad year 2 winters back. A year no one in Veludvara liked to talk about, when strangers had come through more than once. And not all of them had been kind, and Tissa had learned, the way children learn things they shouldn't have to, that the road could bring trouble as easily as it brought anything good. He still startled at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps, still stood half a step behind his mother whenever a traveller passed through, watching from behind her skirt with the particular wariness of a child who has learned that the world does not always mean well. Her daughter Nandini was 3, and had not yet learned that lesson, and watched the world with the kind of open, unguarded curiosity that made her mother's chest ache with something between love and fear. Nandini chased chickens. Nandini put things in her mouth that shouldn't go in a mouth. Nandini looked at every stranger who passed through Veludvara with the same delighted, uncomplicated interest she gave to beetles and clouds and the particular shape of her own shadow at midday. Sujata sometimes watched her younger child and felt a kind of grief in advance. The knowledge that this openness wouldn't last, that some bad year like the one that had shaped Tissa, would eventually teach Nandini caution too, the way it teaches every child eventually, whether the village means for it to or not. There was a particular ritual to how Sujata managed her 2 children in the grey hour, before full light. One she'd never consciously designed but had simply arrived at, the way most household rituals arrive, through months of trial and the specific requirements of two very different small people. Tissa needed to be woken slowly, spoken to in a low voice, well before he was expected to actually move, given time to orient himself to the fact that morning had come, and nothing dangerous had come with it. Wake him too fast, too loud, and he'd startle into a wariness that would colour the whole first hour of his day. Nandini, by contrast, could be scooped up mid-sleep, still boneless and warm, and would simply blink awake against her mother's shoulder with no complaint at all, trusting the world by default in a way her brother had. Somewhere in that bad year 2 winters back, quietly stopped doing. Sujata sometimes wondered whether that difference between her children said something true about people in general. That trust, once broken even slightly, required so much more careful handling to rebuild than it had ever required to establish in the first place. Nandini had never had reason to doubt the world's basic goodwill. Tissa had once, and it showed in every waking he'd had since, in the careful half-step he kept behind his mother whenever anything unfamiliar crossed their path. This morning, waking them both in the usual sequence, slow words first for Tissa, then the easy lift for Nandini, Sujata found herself thinking, not for the first time, about what it would take to teach a boy like Tissa that the road could still, sometimes, bring something worth trusting. She didn't know yet that the answer to that particular question was already 3 days down that same road, walking toward Veludvara at an unhurried pace, carrying nothing that could hurt him at all. Here's the thing nobody in the village said out loud that morning. Everyone in Veludvara was tired in the same specific way. Not just body tired, though there was plenty of that. The ache in the shoulders from carrying water twice as far as the dry season demanded, the burn in the lower back from bending over cracked earth that gave up less grain with every passing week. Tired underneath the tiredness, the kind that comes from watching a sky that won't rain, day after day, and starting to wonder if it's something you did. If the whole village together had failed some test nobody remembered taking. There's a word for that feeling if you want one. The old teachers who would later shape how people in this part of the world thought about suffering called it dukkha. It doesn't mean disaster, exactly. It's smaller than that, and somehow worse for being smaller. It's the itch under a good year. The thing that's a little bit wrong even when nothing is officially wrong at all. It's the low hum of unease that sits underneath even a full granary, whispering that this, too, will end, that nothing stays the way you want it to stay, that the good years and the bad years are made of the same uncertain cloth. Sujata didn't have the word. She just had the feeling at the grinding stone, before dawn, with 2 children asleep behind her, and a husband on a road she couldn't see the end of, and a sky above her that had forgotten, 3 months running, what it was for. Something in the air had already shifted, though. She just didn't know it yet. By mid-morning, a grain merchant named Revata came down the road with 2 donkeys and a cart half empty of goods, which told anyone paying attention that trade had been slow everywhere, not just in Veludvara. Revata was the kind of man who collected news the way other men collected debts, instinctively, constantly, and with the clear intention of spending it later, in exchange for a meal, a bed, a moment of being the most interesting person in whatever room he happened to be standing in. He had a wide, sun-cracked face, and the particular gift, common to men who spend their whole lives on the road, of seeming to remember everyone he'd ever met, whether or not he actually did. He stopped at Kutika's field first, because Kutika's field was closest to the road, and Kutika straightened up from his work to hear what the man had to say, grateful, if he was honest with himself, for any excuse to stop bending over cracked earth for even a few minutes. "There's a wanderer on this road," Revata said, wiping his face with a cloth that had given up being clean days ago. 3, maybe 4 days out still. A teacher, comes from the Sakyan clan up north, gave up a prince's life for a beggar's robe, if the stories are even half true, walks with a handful of monks, doesn't ask for anything, teaches whoever comes to listen. Kutika grunted, which is what tired farmers do instead of forming opinions. Another one, he said. We've had wanderers through here before, ash-smeared ones who claim they can call the rain, ones who want your last handful of rice for a blessing that never seems to do much blessing. He gestured at the dead-looking field around him. None of it's brought us rain yet. Not like this one, Ravata said. And something in his voice made Kutika actually look up. I've watched him teach, twice now, in 2 different villages, weeks apart. He doesn't perform, doesn't ask for coin, doesn't even ask you to believe him. Just talks. Sits with whoever comes to sit with him, answers whatever's actually troubling them, and somehow you walk away different. Light. Like something you'd been carrying too long had been set down, even if the thing itself hadn't gone anywhere. He said this, the way a man says something he isn't quite sure he believes himself, even though he's watched it happen with his own eyes, twice, in 2 villages he could name if pressed. That's worth remembering. We'll come back to that. Kutika didn't say much in reply, just went back to his work, turning the merchant's words over the way he turned over stubborn soil, without any particular conclusion yet. But something had lodged in him anyway, a small seed of the same curiosity that was, at that very moment, spreading quietly through the rest of Veludvara, like water finding the lowest ground. By the time Ravata reached the village center, the news had outrun him, the way news does in small places, passed hut to hut faster than any one person could carry it, growing new details and losing old ones with every retelling, the way village stories always do. By noon, some versions had the wanderer performing miracles. Other versions insisted he demanded nothing at all, not even a place to sleep, which struck several villagers as either deeply admirable or deeply suspicious, depending on how the last few wandering strangers had treated them. Sona, the teenage granddaughter of old Vadamata, was the first young person to hear it and feel something other than fear. She was 15, restless in the way 15-year-olds in small villages tend to be, old enough to notice how small Veludvara actually was, how little happened here from season to season, and young enough to still believe, somewhere under her restlessness, that something interesting might eventually happen to her, specifically. The idea of someone new on the road, someone worth talking about, someone people traveled miles to see, lit something in her that she didn't bother hiding. A teacher, she said to her grandmother, breathless, crouching by the fire where Vadamata sat grinding turmeric root with hands that had done the same motion for 60 years. Ravata says he's coming this way, says people change just from talking to him. Says he used to be a prince, if you can believe that, and gave it all up to walk around asking nothing of anybody. Vadamata didn't look up right away. Her hands kept moving, steady, the turmeric turning slowly to a fine golden powder that would season whatever thin soup the household managed that evening. And when she finally spoke, her voice had gone somewhere else, somewhere further back than the conversation they were having, somewhere Sona had never quite heard her grandmother's voice go before. We had one come through here once, she said, long before you, before your mother even. A stranger at the gate stones, asking only to rest a night and share whatever the village could spare. What happened? The old woman's hands slowed on the turmeric, then stopped altogether. My grandmother turned him away, she said. Told him the village had nothing to give a stranger it didn't know. He walked on, didn't argue, didn't curse us the way you might expect a wronged man to. Just walked on, into the dark toward the forest. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on something that wasn't in the room at all. She talked about it for the rest of her life, never said why it bothered her so much, just that she should have given him water at least, just water. That's all she'd say over and over some evenings, out of nowhere, decades after it happened. Just water. And she never even gave him that. Sona waited for more. There wasn't any more, not yet. The story just sat there, half told, the way old stories do when the person telling them isn't ready to finish. You should hold on to that. It matters more than it seems to right now. Across the village, in the largest house, the only one with a proper wooden door instead of a hanging cloth, Mahanama, the headman of Veludvara, stood at his window and watched the road, though there was nothing yet to see. He had heard the news the way headmen always hear news, last and second-hand, filtered through 3 mouths before it reached his own ears, each version slightly different from the last, arriving finally as a kind of composite rumor that told him less about the actual wanderer than it told him about how frightened or hopeful each person who'd carried the story happened to be. A wanderer, a teacher, days out. Word said he'd already passed through 2 other villages without incident. Word also said, depending on who you asked, that he'd performed something like a miracle, or that he'd simply talked to some farmers about seeds, and that both of these versions had somehow started from the exact same afternoon. He didn't say anything to his wife, who was watching him from across the room with the particular patience of someone who has learned to wait out her husband's silences, who had learned, over 20 years of marriage, that Mahanama processed difficult things the way a millstone processes grain, slowly, privately, and not always visibly, until the finished product finally emerged. He didn't say anything to his son Yasa, who had come to the doorway to ask if the news was true and had gotten only a short nod in reply, and had retreated back to his own work with the particular disappointment of a young man who wanted, more than he could have said out loud, for his father to actually talk to him about something that mattered. Mahanama simply stood at the window, jaw set, watching a road that for now was empty. Something about the word wanderer had landed in him like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples hadn't reached the surface yet. But watch what happens next, because it isn't what you'd expect from a man who, by every outward measure, had nothing at all to fear from a passing stranger. He was headman. He was respected, mostly. His fields, though hurt by the drought same as everyone's, were not the worst hurt in the village. He had a wife who loved him, and a son who wanted, badly, to be close to him. By any reasonable accounting, Mahanama had less to fear from this wanderer than almost anyone else in Veludvara. And yet, this is not a story about a temple. This is not a story about a miracle arriving all at once, changing everything in a single afternoon, the way the very best always insists these things happen. This is not a story about a village that was ready, waiting with open arms for whatever was coming down that road, hearts already softened, minds already open. This is a story about a village that wasn't ready, tired, frightened, guarding a debt of shame none of them could quite name even to themselves. And what it did anyway in the end, when the moment actually arrived, and there was no more time left to decide in the abstract. That evening, Sujata fed her children the last of the good rice, saving the barley flour for tomorrow, and sat outside her door after they'd fallen asleep, looking at the same grey sky that had disappointed her for 3 months running. The stars, when they came out at all these days, seemed to come out reluctantly, as if even the sky itself had grown tired of watching a drought it couldn't fix. She thought about Nanda, somewhere on the road south, and hoped he was safe, and hoped he'd come home soon, though she had no way of knowing when soon would actually be. She thought, too, in the particular unfocused way exhausted parents think at the end of a long day, about nothing in particular, the sound of her children's breathing behind her, the weight of tomorrow's chores already stacking themselves in her mind, the small, constant arithmetic of a household with not quite enough of anything. She didn't think about the wanderer. Not yet. Why would she? He was still days away, an abstraction, a piece of gossip carried by a tired merchant with 2 half-empty donkeys, and a talent for making everything sound slightly more remarkable than it probably was. There was nothing in that evening to suggest that a stranger walking slowly down a forgotten road would, within the week, change the shape of everything she thought she knew about her own village, about the headman who ruled it, about the old woman who told half-finished stories by the fire, about the man nobody looked at anymore who lived just past the boundary stones, about her own husband's homecoming, and about what, exactly, it meant to welcome someone into a place that had learned, slowly and for good reasons, to be careful about who it let in. But that's not the part that mattered yet. Not on this particular evening. What mattered on this particular evening was smaller than that. It was Vadamata, alone by her dying fire long after Sona had gone to sleep, turning over a memory that had sat unfinished in her for 60 years. A stranger at the gate, a grandmother who gave nothing, not even water, and a silence that had somehow outlived 3 generations without ever once being explained, passed down not as a story with a lesson but as a kind of inherited ache, felt more than understood. The old woman looked toward the dark shape of the gate stones, barely visible now against the deepening night, and said nothing at all. But something had shifted. You could feel it if you were paying attention. A door that had been shut for 60 years had very quietly, very slightly, ajar, not opened, not yet, just no longer quite so firmly latched as it had been that morning. The road, meanwhile, kept doing what roads do. It simply continued, past the last hut, past the fields, past the gate stones, out toward the forest and whatever was walking, unhurried, somewhere along its length, indifferent to the fears and hopes gathering on either side of it. 3 days out. Maybe less, if the weather held, though the weather this particular season had not been in the habit of holding anything at all, down at the grinding stone. Before any of this had happened, before Revata had even reached the village with his news, Sujata had paused for a moment in her work and looked up at the grey sky, the way she did most mornings, searching it for any sign, a darker cloud, a shift in the wind, anything that might suggest the drought was finally nearing its end. There was nothing. There was never anything, these past 3 months, and she had learned to look anyway, the way a person keeps checking a door they know is locked, simply because the checking itself had become part of the ritual of hoping. Veludvara slept that night the way it had slept every night for months, hungry, tired, and afraid of a sky that wouldn't rain. None of them knew yet that the thing to be afraid of, and the thing to hope for, were about to turn out to be exactly the same thing, walking toward them one slow, unhurried step at a time, carrying nothing but a robe, a bowl, and a way of looking at the world that would, before the week was out, ask every single person in Veludvara the same quiet question, in one form or another. What are you actually afraid of, and is it real? Chapter 2. What the headman remembers. By now word of the wanderer had reached every hearth in Veludvara, but it hadn't reached the one man whose word would decide what happened next. Not yet. Anyway, though Mahanama had already made up more of his mind than he would have admitted to anyone, including himself, and would have bristled if anyone had suggested otherwise. He sat alone that night, long after his wife and son had gone to sleep, in the one chair in the house that had been his father's. It was a plain thing, wood-worn smooth at the arms, legs slightly uneven on the packed earth floor, so that it rocked faintly if you shifted your weight the wrong way. Mahanama rarely sat in it. It wasn't a rule, exactly. Nobody had ever told him not to, but some chairs simply hold too much of another person to be comfortable, and this was one of them. Tonight he sat in it anyway, because tonight the thing he'd spent 30 years not thinking about had climbed up out of wherever he kept it and was sitting in the room with him, uninvited, the way old shame does when something in the present rattles the door of its cage. His father had been headman before him, a good man, mostly. Mahanama believed that still, even now, even after everything, fair with grain disputes, patient with the old and the very young, the kind of man villagers came to when they needed a decision made and trusted, more often than not, that the decision would be a sound one. But there had been a year, when Mahanama was a boy of 9 or 10, when a wandering ascetic had come through Veludvara and stood at this very gate and told the village, plainly, in front of everyone gathered to see the stranger, that the coming season would bring a poor harvest unless certain things changed. What things, exactly, nobody could quite remember afterward. That was the strange part. The warning had been specific in the moment. Mahanama remembered, even now, the particular cadence of the man's voice, urgent and certain, and vague in the memory, the way prophecies always seem to work once. Enough years have passed, and the details have worn smooth like river stones. His father had laughed the man off, publicly, in front of the whole village, at the gatestones, in a voice loud enough that everyone heard it, including 9-year-old Mahanama standing at his father's side, proud in the particular, uncomplicated way a boy is proud of his father before he's old enough to know better. He remembered the sound of his father's laugh specifically, a big, booming thing, meant to carry, meant to signal to everyone watching that this was nonsense, that a headman worth his position didn't bend to every wandering fortune-teller who happened to pass through with a dire warning and an outstretched bowl. The harvest that year failed, badly, worse than anyone could remember, worse even than the drought Veludvara was living through right now. 3 months of ash-colored sky notwithstanding, and the village, which forgives almost anything except a leader who was wrong out loud, in front of everyone, with real confidence, never quite let his father forget it. Mahanama had watched it happen slowly, over years. The sideways looks at gatherings, the quiet jokes that stopped the moment his father entered a room, but that everyone knew had been happening a moment before, the erosion of something that used to be called respect, worn down not by any single dramatic confrontation, but by 1,000 small withdrawals, the way a riverbank erodes, invisible day to day, undeniable by the end of a decade. His father had died still headman, technically, the position passing to Mahanama, the way these things did in Veludvara, by a kind of quiet inherited consensus rather than any formal vote. He remembered too, a smaller detail from that same year, one he'd never told anyone, not even his wife, the specific way his father's hands had trembled, just slightly, gripping the edge of the gate stone as the harvest reports came in worse and worse over those following weeks. His father had never once let his voice shake in public, but Mahanama, 9 years old and watching closely the way children watch their parents in moments of crisis, had seen the hands and had understood, even then, without the words for it yet, that his father's confidence had been a performance covering something considerably less certain underneath. But he died a man the village tolerated rather than trusted, and Mahanama had understood, even as a young man burying his father, that something precious had been lost in that one afternoon at the gatestones, lost in a way that 30 subsequent years of careful, dutiful leadership on his father's part had never quite managed to win back. 9-year-old Mahanama had learned exactly one lesson from all of that, and it had shaped the whole rest of his life so thoroughly that he'd long since stopped experiencing it as a lesson at all. It had simply become the water he swam in. Never be caught wrong, out loud, in front of everyone. Never let a wandering stranger with an uncertain warning stand at your gate and make a fool of you, and by extension your family, and by further extension your children, and whatever they might inherit of your standing, in front of your own people. What almost nobody in the village ever understood about Mahanama, not even his own son, was this. His caution wasn't cowardice, not exactly or not only that. It was armor built out of another man's humiliation. welded on so early and so thoroughly that Mahanama himself had mostly forgotten it was armor at all. He thought it was just who he was, careful, firm, in control. A man who thought 3 steps ahead of every decision because that was simply good leadership. Not because a 9-year-old boy standing beside his laughing father at the gate stones had, 30 years ago, quietly promised himself never to feel that particular shape of shame again. There was a knock at the door, soft, deliberate, the knock of a man who knocks mostly as a formality. Bhagu, the village's Brahmin priest, letting himself in without quite waiting for an answer, the way men do when they've decided in advance that the answer will be yes, and have simply skipped the part of the conversation where anyone actually says so. "You've heard then," Bhagu said, settling onto the mat across from Mahanama without being asked, arranging his robes with the particular, unhurried precision of a man who has spent decades performing small ceremonies and has never quite learned to move any other way. "Everyone's heard. And you know what he'll do, this wanderer, if you let him in." Bhagu's voice had the particular smoothness of a man rehearsing an argument he'd already had, silently several times that day, polishing each phrase the way a craftsman polishes a blade before it's ever drawn. "He'll undercut everything, the rites, the offerings, my place here, and by extension, yours. These wandering teachers don't build anything, Mahanama. They only take apart what's already standing, and they leave before anyone has to clean up what's left. I've seen it in 2 other villages I know of, and it's always the same pattern. People so dazzled by a stranger's fresh words that they forget the slow, patient work of the priests and elders who've held things together for generations." Mahanama didn't answer right away. He was looking at his father's chair arm under his own hand, at the worn place where 3 decades of a different man's grip had smoothed the wood into something almost soft, almost warm, the way wood gets when enough human contact has worn away its harder edges. "He hasn't done anything yet," Mahanama said finally. "He's still days out. Whatever else he is, he hasn't stood at our gate yet and said a single word to a single person in Veludvara. That's exactly when you decide," Bhagu said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping into the register he used for what he considered his most important pronouncements. "Before he arrives. Once he's standing at the gate speaking to your own people, it's already too late to decide anything sensible. You'll just be reacting the way a man reacts to a fire that's already spread past the point where it could have been easily put out. Better to decide the shape of things now, while your head is clear, than to try to decide anything once half the village is already standing in that field listening to him." He leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting from strategy towards something more personal, more pointed, though he likely didn't fully register the shift himself. "You know what happened the last time a wanderer's words got ahead of this village's judgment. It wasn't a cruel thing to say, not exactly. Bhagu likely didn't even mean it as a direct hit. He was talking about caution in general, the abstract danger of unvetted strangers with big claims, a well-worn cautionary theme he'd probably used in a dozen other contexts over the years, without ever once thinking specifically of Mahanama's father. But it landed the way certain sentences land when they happen to walk straight into an old wound without meaning to. The way a careless elbow finds an old bruise nobody remembered to warn you about. Mahanama's jaw tightened just slightly, and Bhagu, watching closely, because watching closely was, after all, most of what a village priest actually did for a living, saw it and understood he'd found something useful, even if he didn't fully understand what, and filed the observation away for later use without a second thought. There's a quieter thing happening underneath this conversation if you're paying attention to it. 2 frightened men, for 2 different reasons, talking each other into the same conclusion, and each one privately convinced his fear is the reasonable one. and the other man's fear is just prudence, the ordinary, unremarkable good sense of a careful leadership. Neither of them would have called it fear out loud to the other, or to themselves. They had better words for it. Everyone always does. "I'll receive him at the gate," Mahanama said at last, the decision settling into place the way decisions do, once a man has been circling them long enough that the actual moment of deciding feels almost anticlimactic. Not inside it. He can rest his people in the field beyond the stones. That's hospitality enough for a stranger. Nobody's vetted. Water if they ask for it, no harm done to them, but no closer than that. Not until we know more about who he actually is. Bhagu nodded slowly, satisfied, though something in his own chest, a small, quiet, unwelcome thing, the same splinter of doubt that had been needling at him without his fully noticing, didn't feel as settled as his face let on. He said nothing about that part. Men rarely do, especially men whose whole livelihood depends on appearing certain. After Bhagu left, Mahanama sat alone again in his father's chair, in the dark for a long time. His wife came to stand in the doorway of the room, having woken, or perhaps never quite having slept, and watched her husband in the dying firelight for a while without announcing herself. "You've decided something," she said finally. Not a question either, the two of them sharing that particular habit of statement instead of question that 20 years of marriage tends to produce. The wanderer stays outside the gate. His people can rest in the field. She was quiet for a moment, and Mahanama, who knew her silences almost as well as he knew his own, understood that she was deciding whether to say the next thing at all. "Your father would have done the same," she said eventually, and it wasn't clear even to her whether she meant it as comfort or as something closer to a warning. Mahanama didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that wouldn't have required opening the exact door he'd spent 30 years keeping shut. Not even to her, not even in the private dark of their own house, where nearly everything else between them had, over the years, eventually found its way into the open. She didn't press him further. She had learned, the way Bhagu had learned to press, and Mahanama had learned to withhold, exactly how far a silence could be pushed in this particular marriage, before it turned brittle instead of merely quiet. She went back to bed. Mahanama stayed in his father's chair a while longer, listening to the house settle around him, before finally following her, carrying with him, unspoken, the particular loneliness of a man who has built a life designed to protect him from exactly the kind of closeness that might have actually helped him carry it. Outside, somewhere in the village, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The sky, as it had for 3 months now, held no rain and made no promises, the stars appearing one by one in a slow, indifferent scatter that offered no particular comfort to a man wrestling with 30 years of inherited fear. Upstairs, though he didn't know it, his son Yasa lay awake too, having heard just enough of the conversation, through the thin wall, to understand that his father had already decided something important, and hadn't asked anyone else in the house what they thought about it. Yasa was 22, old enough to have his own opinions, and young enough to still mostly keep them to himself, caught in that particular stage of a young man's life where he could see his father's blind spots more clearly than his father could, and had not yet found a way to say so that wouldn't feel, to both of them, like disrespect. He turned the wanderers coming over in his mind, not with his father's dread, and not yet with anything he'd call hope, either, just a kind of unfamiliar curiosity, small and quiet, that he didn't have a name for, sitting somewhere between his father's certainty and his own unformed sense that there might be more to this than caution demanded. He thought, briefly, about what it might be like to walk to the gate himself, someday soon, and see for himself, instead of simply accepting his father's account of things secondhand, the way he'd accepted so much else about how Veludvara ought to be run. That's not nothing, remember that. It'll matter later, more than either of them yet understood, lying in their separate rooms under the same dry, starless sky, each carrying a different weight of the same inherited fear. Chapter 3. The debt Kutika won't say out loud. While Mahanama wrestled with old ghosts indoors, out in the fields a different kind of fear was taking root, quieter, and in its own way just as old, though it wore an entirely different face. Kutika had been up since before light, same as most farmers, with half a harvest to save, and no rain to save it with. His field sat close to the road, which meant he saw everyone who passed through Veludvara before most of the village did, and it also meant everyone who passed through saw him, bent over, cracked earth, doing work that increasingly felt like arguing with a wall that had already decided, long ago, not to listen. He'd inherited the field from his own father, a smaller, worse-drained plot than most of the village's better land, the kind of ground that had always demanded more from a farmer than it gave back, even in good years. This was not a good year. Megara's steward found him there a little after mid-morning. The steward was a thin, careful man named Gosaka, who had the particular talent, common to men in his position, of delivering unpleasant news in a tone so polite, it was almost impossible to be angry at him directly. A skill Kutika suspected Megara valued in him, precisely because it let Megara himself stay pleasantly removed from the discomfort of his own demands. Megara sends his regards, Gosaka said, which meant nothing, and both men knew it meant nothing. And a reminder. The debt on the back field comes due at week's end. Kutika kept working, not looking up, because looking up would have meant showing his face. And his face right now had things on it he didn't want seen, not by Gosaka, who would carry the report back faithfully, word for word, expression for expression, to a man who read faces the way other men read ledgers. I know when it's due. Of course, I only mention it because, well, the season hasn't been kind. Megara wanted you to know he's aware of that. He's not without sympathy. Gosaka said this with the particular blandness of a man delivering a line he'd been given rather than one he'd chosen. And Kutika suspected, not for the first time, that even Gosaka found parts of this job distasteful, though he'd never once seen the steward's composure crack enough to confirm it. Tell him I appreciate his sympathy, Kutika said, in a voice flat enough that the sarcasm barely needed pointing out, though he made sure it was there anyway. A small private satisfaction in a morning that otherwise offered him none. Gosaka left the way he'd arrived, unhurried, apologetic, entirely unmoved, his sandals making a soft, even sound on the dry path back toward the road. Kutika thought, watching Gosaka's retreating back, about the particular cruelty of debts that arrive dressed in politeness. How much harder it was, somehow, to be angry at a demand delivered gently than one delivered harshly. How the gentleness itself seemed to forbid the one response that might have actually let some of the pressure out. And Kutika stood alone in his field for a long moment after, not working, just breathing. The particular kind of breathing a man does when he's trying to keep something from climbing up out of his chest and into his throat, where it might, if he wasn't careful, come out as something he couldn't take back, a shout, maybe, at nobody in particular, or worse, tears which a grown man working his own field in full view of the road could absolutely not afford to be seen having. Here's what almost got lost in a story like this one. If you're not careful, it's tempting to see a man like Kutika from the outs and think, simply, farmer, debt, drought, as if that's the whole of it, a simple equation of hardship anyone could understand at a glance. But the actual weight he was carrying wasn't the debt itself. It was the fact that he hadn't told his wife the exact amount. Hadn't told anyone. He could say drought out loud, easily, the way every farmer in the village said it a dozen times a day, almost as a greeting. He could say bad season out loud, could say it with a rueful shake of his head that invited sympathy without requiring anything specific in return. What he could not make himself say even alone in his own field, was the number. Because the number, once spoken, would be real in a way it currently wasn't. And Kutika had built a small, fragile peace out of not letting it be real yet. A peace that cost him sleep and appetite, and the particular tightness in his chest that had become, over these past weeks, almost a permanent resident. That evening, at the blacksmith's forge on the other side of the village, a very different kind of man was hearing the same news about the wanderer that everyone else had heard, and having a very different kind of reaction to it. Kanda the blacksmith didn't look up from the blade he was working. The hammer falling in its steady, practiced rhythm against metal that glowed a dull orange in the forge light. "A teacher," he said, in the tone of a man repeating a word he found faintly ridiculous, turning it over like a coin he suspected of being counterfeit. Everyone's a teacher these days. Half of them can't teach a plough how to turn a field, let alone a person how to live one. "This one's supposed to be different," said the boy working the bellows, a nephew of Kanda's learning the trade, young enough still to find the idea of a wandering holy man more interesting than skeptical. "They're always supposed to be different." Kanda turned the blade, checking the edge against the firelight with the narrow, focused attention of a man who trusted his own eyes over any amount of second-hand testimony. "I trust what I can weigh in my hand. Iron doesn't lie to you. Iron doesn't promise you anything it can't deliver, doesn't tell you a harvest's coming that never comes, doesn't ask you to believe something you can't see or touch or test with your own two hands." He set the blade down, wiping his palms on a cloth blackened by years of forged soot. A man walks into a village with nothing but words, and everyone loses their minds over it. Words are the cheapest thing there is. Everyone's got a mouth, myself included, on a bad enough day. It wasn't cruelty in Kanda, exactly, more a kind of hard-won practicality, the trust of a man who'd built his whole life on things he could see and touch and test, who had learned his craft through burns and failed blades, and the slow, unglamorous accumulation of skill that no amount of talk could substitute for. He wasn't afraid of the wanderer the way Mahanama was afraid, weighted down by 30 years of inherited shame, or ashamed the way Kutika was ashamed, carrying a debt he couldn't bring himself to name. He simply didn't expect anything from him, one way or the other, and there's its own kind of quiet armor in expecting nothing, a different shield than fear or pride, but a shield nonetheless, one that had served Kanda well enough, so far, in a life that hadn't given him much reason to trust things he couldn't hammer into shape himself. The boy working Kanda's bellows turned the wanderer's story over in his own mind that evening, long after his uncle had moved on to other complaints about other things. He hadn't said much during Kanda's dismissal of the whole business, hadn't felt it was his place to argue with a man who was, after all, teaching him a trade that would feed him for the rest of his life. But privately, working the bellows in the forge's steady orange light, he found himself hoping, in the small, unguarded way children hope for things they don't fully understand yet, that his uncle was wrong about this particular stranger, that not everything worth trusting had to be something you could weigh in your hand. He didn't say this to Kanda. He simply kept working the bellows, the fire breathing steady and bright with each pump, and let the hope sit quietly in him, where his uncle's certainty couldn't reach it. It's worth noticing how many people in Veludvara that week were carrying some private hope or fear they hadn't yet said aloud to anyone. A whole village of unspoken things, moving past each other, at wells and fences and forge fires, none of them quite realizing how many of their neighbors were carrying some version of the exact same weight. Sujata gave her children the smaller share of the evening meal that night, again keeping back what little extra there was in case tomorrow was worse. A small, unremarkable act of dana that she wouldn't have called generosity, because to her it was just what a mother does, the same unthinking, Automatic sacrifice mothers had been making in Veludvara for as long as anyone could remember. Unremarked, uncelebrated, simply woven into the fabric of what it meant to have children in a hard year. It's easy to miss why this matters, but it's worth noticing. The giving that costs the giver. Something is the only giving that has ever really counted for much, in any tradition, anywhere in the world. Across every generation that has ever had to decide, at a shared table with not quite enough food, who eats and who goes a little hungrier that night. Sujata had never heard that idea stated so plainly, had never sat with a teacher who might have named it for her. She lived it anyway, every evening, without needing the words. The same way she'd lived 100 other truths about sacrifice and love that no one had ever bothered to write down for people like her. There's a story worth telling here about how fear moves through a place like Veludvara, not all at once the way you'd expect, sweeping through like a single dramatic storm, but in these small, separate currents that don't yet know they're connected to each other, each one flowing along its own private channel. Mahanama's fear, welded from his father's shame 30 years back, dressed up nightly in the language of caution and prudence. Kutika's fear, folded so tight around an unspoken number it had become its own kind of silence. A debt he could name to a merchant's passing question but not to his own wife. Kanda's guarded practicality, which looked like fearlessness from the outside but was really just a different shape of the same caution. A wall built out of iron and calluses instead of pride, but a wall all the same. 3 men, 3 fields, 3 private storms, none of them talking to each other about any of it, each one certain, in his own quiet way, that his particular caution was simply good sense. If you've ever been the person in a room too proud to say what you actually owe, not just money but anything, an apology, a fear, a piece of the truth you've been sitting on, because saying it out loud might make it too real to take back. You already understand Kutika better than he understands himself right now. Tell me below, what's the hardest thing you've ever had to admit out loud, and how long did you wait before you finally said it? Centuries after this particular drought, on the facade of an empire that didn't exist yet, a young king named Ashoka would come to understand something about fear-based rule that Mahanama hadn't learned yet, and Kutika couldn't yet afford to think about, being far too occupied with the more immediate arithmetic of a debt and a failing field. Ashoka built his early reign on conquest and terror, expanding his territory through one of the bloodiest campaigns his region had ever seen, a war so devastating that the accounts of it, even softened by centuries of retelling, still carry the weight of genuine horror. And then, standing in the wreckage of a war he'd won, surveying the true cost of what fear and force had actually purchased him, he found that terror, however completely it wins a battle, has an expiration date. It always eventually meets something inside a person or a village or an empire that it cannot fully control. Some stubborn, ungovernable core that force alone can never quite subdue. Ashoka would spend the second half of his life trying to rule by something other than fear. He'd carve his new understanding into rock, in edicts scattered across his territory, so it would outlast him, a king trying, imperfectly and late, to leave behind something other than the memory of what his armies had done. Mahanama, at this point in the story, was still a long way from anything like that kind of turning. So, in his own way, was Kutika, still bent over his cracked field, still unable to say a single number out loud to the one person who might actually help him carry it. But that's not the strangest part. The strangest part is how ordinary all of it looked from the outside on any given evening in Veludvara that week. Just a village, tired, waiting for rain that showed no sign of coming. Nobody watching from outside would have guessed that 3 days down the road, something was walking slowly toward all of it that would eventually touch every one of these private, separate fears, Mahanama's, Kutika's, kandhas, and half a dozen others besides, and loosen every single one of them, one at a time, in ways none of these men could possibly have predicted on this particular grey, hungry evening. Chapter 4. 3 days out 3 days. That's what Veludvara had left before the wanderer reached its gate. Though almost no one in the village was counting the same way, some marking the days with dread, some with a curiosity they were only beginning to admit to themselves, and most simply going about the ordinary business of a hard season without much thought for the road at all. Down the road, past 2 more villages, and a stretch of dry riverbed that had once been a proper crossing, the wanderer and his small band of monks moved at the unhurried pace of men who had somewhere to be and no attachment to arriving quickly. There were only a handful of them at this point in the journey. The teacher himself, robed simply, his bearing unhurried in a way that made every other traveler on that road seem, by comparison, faintly frantic, and 2 monks who walked close beside him. Ananda, young still, watchful, already showing the quiet competence that would one day make him indispensable, the kind of young man who noticed a stranger's discomfort before the stranger himself had fully registered it. And Nagasamala, older, quieter, content to walk and say little, carrying himself with the settled ease of a man who had made peace, long ago, with owning almost nothing. A farmer working a field near the road that morning would later tell the story for years, to anyone who'd listen, about the day he watched the group stop for a broken cart. An old man, a stranger even to that village, just passing through with a cartload of firewood he'd meant to sell 3 villages further on, had a wheel split clean through on a rutted stretch of road. His cart tipped half into a ditch. A small mountain of firewood spilled across the dirt in a chaotic scatter. He was cursing under his breath, sweating despite the relatively cool morning, clearly past the age where lifting a loaded cartwheel by himself was something his body could actually manage, whatever his pride insisted otherwise. The monks simply stopped. Nobody asked them to. Ananda and Nagasamala set down their bowls without a word passing between them. The kind of wordless coordination that comes from long familiarity, and the wanderer himself, the teacher, the one people were already calling remarkable up and down this road, knelt in the dirt beside the old man's cart, without a word of announcement, without waiting to be thanked, without so much as glancing around to see whether anyone was watching this small act of kindness, and began stacking spilled firewood back into a neat pile, his robes gathering dust in a way that seemed to trouble him not at all. The old man protested, the way people do when help arrives from an unexpected and undignified direction, embarrassment mixing awkwardly with gratitude. "You don't need to. I can manage. You'll manage faster with 4 hands than 2, the wanderer said. And that was the whole of it. No sermon. No lesson attached to the moment like a price tag waiting to be collected later. Just the plain, unremarkable fact of 3 men. Helping a stranger fix a wheel because the wheel needed fixing, and they happened to be standing there, with hands free and time to spare, on an otherwise unremarkable morning. The watching farmer told people afterward that what struck him wasn't the kindness itself. Plenty of travelers might have stopped to help, and some no doubt had over the years at that same stretch of rutted road. It was that nobody made anything out of it. No speech about compassion once the wheel was fixed. No moment where the teacher turned to his monks to explain the deeper meaning of the act, the way the farmer half expected, having heard so many stories already about this particular wanderer's supposed wisdom. They fixed the wheel, helped the old man restack his wood into something resembling its original order, accepted a small share of the man's water in thanks, because refusing outright would have embarrassed him further, and walked on. The conversation already moved to something else entirely by the time they were 50 paces down the road. Something about the shape of the clouds. If the farmer remembered rightly, Nothing more significant than that. Notice how little ceremony it took if you're watching closely. Metta, loving kindness, doesn't actually announce itself in its purest form. It just moves. It fixes the wheel. The word would come later, in teachings, explained and unpacked and turned into doctrine. Doctrine for people who needed the doctrine to understand what they'd witnessed, who needed the philosophy laid out in careful, memorizable stages before they could recognize what had, in fact, already happened in front of them without any philosophy attached at all. In the moment itself, it just looked like three tired travelers stopping to help an old man with a broken cart, the way anyone might, if they happened to have the time and the inclination and hadn't yet trained themselves to walk past inconvenience. The old man with the broken cart, once his wheel was fixed and his firewood restacked, sat for a while at the edge of the road watching the small group prepare to continue on, turning something over in his own weathered face. He was not, by nature, a man given to asking questions of strangers, having lived a long life built mostly on minding his own affairs and expecting others to do the same. But something about the ease with which they'd helped him, no fuss, no lecture, no visible expectation of gratitude beyond what he'd have offered any traveler who'd done him the same kindness, loosened something in him enough to ask one question before they left. Why help an old man you'll never see again? The wanderer considered this with the same unhurried attention he seemed to give everything. Because you needed help, and we were here to give it. I'm not sure the seeing again has much to do with it, one way or the other. A kindness doesn't need a future to be worth doing. The old man had no response to that, not one he could immediately put into words, and simply nodded and watched them go, and found himself, an hour later, still turning the wanderer's answer over as he continued down the road with his repaired cart, a small, unexpected lightness in his chest that he couldn't entirely account for. Back in Veludvara, that same afternoon, Sona heard a slightly different version of the same story, filtered, as stories are, through two more mouths by the time it reached her. The firewood now somehow doubled in quantity, and the old man's cart somehow transformed into something closer to a proper merchant's wagon, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not fear, and not even simple curiosity anymore, but something closer to recognition. As if some part of her had been quietly waiting, without knowing it, for proof that kindness like that was even still a thing people did without being asked or paid or thanked for it. A kind of confirmation of something she'd hoped was true about the world, but had never quite had reason to believe. "You believe all this?" her grandmother asked, watching her granddaughter's face with the particular sharpness of someone who has outlived several of village gossip and knows exactly how these stories tend to grow legs, tends to sprout new firewood and finer carts with every retelling until the original event is barely recognizable underneath its own embellishments. "I don't know if I believe it," Sona said slowly, turning the question over with more care than she usually gave to anything. "But I don't see why I shouldn't at least go find out for myself instead of deciding in advance, one way or the other, based on what three different people who weren't even there decided to tell me about it." Vadamata was quiet for a moment. There was something in that answer, simple, almost obvious when you said it out loud, the kind of plain good sense that somehow manages to elude most people, most of the time. That the old woman hadn't quite managed herself in 60 years of carrying a half-finished story about a stranger. Her own grandmother had turned away without ever once going to find out for herself what kind of stranger he'd actually been, what he might have said if given the water he'd only asked for and never received. Notice who isn't speaking right now in a story like this one. Mahanama has already decided. Bhargu has already decided. Even Kanda, in his own dismissive way, has decided iron and calluses. standing in for an opinion he'd never bothered to form more carefully. It is a 15-year-old girl who is the first person in the whole village to say out loud some version of "I don't know." And I'd like to find out a sentence simpler and braver than anything the village's adults had managed among themselves so far. That's not a small thing, however small it might have sounded at the time. Tossed off almost casually by the fire, while her grandmother's hands finally resumed their slow work on the turmeric. Meanwhile, on the road that same afternoon, Yasa, Mahanama's son, happened to pass close enough to the traveling group to see them from a distance, resting under a stand of trees while the worst heat of the day passed, an errand from his mother having sent him further down the road than his usual chores required. He didn't approach. He'd been raised too carefully for that, and his father's decision about the gatestones was already understood, even unspoken, as the family's official position, a boundary he wouldn't have dreamed of crossing on his own initiative, whatever quiet doubts he might be nursing. But he slowed his steps as he passed, close enough to notice the way the wanderer sat, unhurried, entirely at ease, the posture of a man with nowhere else he needed to be, shoulders loose in a way Yasa couldn't remember ever seeing in his own tightly wound father, and something in Yasa, some small crack that had opened the night he'd overheard his father and Bagu talking in the dark through the thin wall between their rooms, widened just slightly further, almost imperceptibly, the way a hairline fracture in old wood widens under repeated small pressures rather than any single dramatic blow. He said nothing to his father when he got home, but something had shifted. You could see it, if you knew to look. In the particular way he was quiet at the evening meal, not sullen, the way he sometimes got when a chore had gone badly, or his father had corrected him too sharply in front of others, but thoughtful, turning something over that he wasn't ready to say out loud yet, chewing his food slowly, eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the room he was actually sitting in. He thought, walking the rest of the way home, about how rarely he'd seen his own father simply sit still, unhurried, the way the wanderer had been sitting under those trees. Mahanama moved through every day, like a man checking a long list only he could see, and Yasa had never once questioned whether that particular restlessness was necessary, had simply assumed it was what leadership required, until this one small, ordinary glimpse of a different kind of stillness entirely. There's a teaching that would come later, in the wanderer's own words, about a field and a farmer, about faith as the seed, effort as the rain that makes it grow, and mindfulness as the plow that turns the ground so the seed can actually take root, instead of scattering uselessly across hard soil, blown away by the first strong wind. Yasa hadn't heard that teaching yet. Neither had his father, but something in Yasa's own ground, quietly and without his full permission, had already started to turn, loosened just enough by one distant glimpse of an unhurried stranger resting under a stand of trees to make room, eventually, for something to grow there that hadn't had room to grow before. 3 days out, maybe 2. Now, if the weather held, and the road stayed dry, which seemed, this particular season, like an increasingly reasonable bet, given how stubbornly the sky had refused to do anything at all. Down in Veludvara, nobody knew exactly how close the wanderer actually was, only that he was closer than he'd been yesterday, and would be closer still tomorrow, and that whatever the village decided to do about that, the decision was arriving faster than any of them had quite prepared for, faster, certainly, than Mahanama's careful, deliberate mind wanted to move. Chapter 5. The question Bagu won't ask Sona wasn't the only one whose fear had started to loosen, but hers was the only kind, so far, that anyone in Veludvara was willing to admit to out loud, in the open, without dressing it up as something more respectable. Bigu lay awake that night, the same night Mahanama had made his decision about the gate, turning over a question he hadn't expected to still be asking himself at this hour, with the fire outside his window long since burned down to embers and the rest of the village asleep around him. He had spoken with such certainty to Mahanama, such easy, practiced confidence. The wanderer would undercut the rites, undercut his place, undercut the whole careful architecture Bigu had spent 20 years building as the village's only bridge to anything sacred, the accumulated trust of 2 decades of correctly timed ceremonies and carefully remembered household names at every blessing. He believed that, mostly. But there was a smaller, quieter question sitting underneath the certainty, and it had kept him up past the point where sleep should have taken him easily, past the point where his body, tired from a long day, should by rights have simply carried him off regardless of what his mind was doing. How exactly did he know that? He had never actually heard the man teach, not once, not even second-hand from someone he fully trusted. Everything he knew about this wanderer came from Rivata, the grain merchant, whose livelihood depended on being interesting company, and from travelers' half-formed rumors passed along at wells and crossroads, and from his own 20 years of watching other wandering ascetics pass through with big claims and small substance. Men who promised rain and delivered nothing, men who demanded elaborate offerings and vanished before the season's results could prove them wrong. He thought unwillingly of a story he'd heard once, not about this wanderer, but about a different village entirely, called Kesaputta, where the people had grown so tired of contradictory holy men, passing through, each one condemning the last and praising only himself, each one certain of something different, that they'd finally asked a teacher passing through exactly that question. How do we know who to trust when everyone who comes through here claims to be the one telling the truth, and each claim cancels out the one before it? Bagu didn't know how that story ended. He'd only heard the question, second-hand, from a trader years back, told almost as a joke about the general foolishness of village credulity, and it had stuck with him the way an unanswered question does. A splinter you forget about until something presses on it again, until the exact same uncertainty resurfaces in your own chest. On a sleepless night decades later, lying in the dark now, he realized the splinter had just been pressed on, hard, by his own certainty about a man he hadn't met, a certainty that suddenly felt less like wisdom and more like exactly the kind of unexamined conviction the Kesaputta villagers had been complaining about in the first place. He didn't say any of this to Mahanama. He didn't say it to anyone, not his wife, not the handful of villagers who sometimes came to him for guidance on smaller matters. The truth, nobody in Veludvara was willing to admit that weak was simpler and less flattering. Nearly everyone who'd already decided how they felt about the wanderer had decided it without any actual information at all, building elaborate certainty on a foundation of rumor and inherited fear, and, in Mahanama's case, 30-year-old shame that had nothing whatsoever to do with the actual man walking toward their gate. Fear doesn't wait for evidence. It rarely even asks for it, preferring instead the comfortable speed of a conclusion already reached. Bagu rose before dawn that morning, having slept poorly, and did something he hadn't done in longer than he could easily remember. He walked to the small shrine at the edge of his own house and sat with it a while, not performing any particular ritual, just sitting. The way he imagined ordinary villagers sat with their own private troubles when they came to him for guidance, rather than the other way around. He thought about the 20 years he'd spent as the village's bridge to anything sacred, the careful accumulation of trust that had let him bury the dead properly, bless the harvests, name the children, mark every important threshold in Veludvara's collective life. None of that, he realized, sitting there in the grey pre-dawn light, actually required the wanderer to be false. His entire argument to Mahanama had assumed, without ever quite stating it, that there wasn't room in the village for two different kinds of trusted men. He wasn't certain, this particular morning, that the assumption held up to close examination. He thought, too, sitting there in that grey pre-dawn light, of his own teacher, long dead now, who had first trained him in the rites decades ago, and who had once told him, in an offhand comment Bagu had never fully understood until this particular morning, that the surest sign of a false teacher was one who couldn't bear the presence of any other. He hadn't thought of that comment in years. It sat with him now, uncomfortably, refusing to be easily dismissed. He didn't change his position before the village gathering. The habits of 20 years don't unravel in a single sleepless night, however honestly examined. But he noticed, walking toward the gatestones later that morning to stand beside Mahanama while the headman made his announcement, that his own certainty felt thinner than it had 2 days before. Not gone, but worn, the way a well-used path gets worn, until the ground beneath it starts to show through in places it hadn't before. The next morning, Mahanama made his decision public. He called the village together near the gatestones. Not a large gathering. Veludvara wasn't a large village, perhaps 40 adults and their assorted children, but enough people that word would spread accurately. Instead of through the usual game of whispers and distortions that had already in just 2 days turned a broken cartwheel into something closer to a miracle. He stood with his back straight, in the posture of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say more times than he'd ever admit, his voice pitched to carry across the small crowd without seeming to strain for it. The wanderer and his monks may rest in the field beyond the stones, Mahanama announced. They will not come inside the village. Nobody is to bring them past the boundary, to offer them shelter inside a home, or to invite them to any gathering held within the gatestones. This is not unkindness. It's caution, and caution has kept this village safe for longer than any of you have been alive to remember. We don't know this man. We know only what travelers have said of him, and travelers, as most of you well know, are not always the most reliable judges of character, their own or anyone else's. There was a murmur through the small crowd. Not disagreement, exactly. More the low hum of people absorbing a decision they hadn't been asked to help make, some nodding along with the plain good sense of it, others exchanging glances that suggested a quieter reservation they weren't quite ready to voice in front of their headman. Kutika, standing near the back, said nothing, his mind mostly still on the number he hadn't spoken out loud to anyone, the announcement washing over him without fully landing. Kanda, arms crossed, looked entirely unmoved, since as far as he was concerned this whole conversation was about a man who hadn't done anything yet, one way or the other, and wasn't worth this much collective anxiety either way. Sona, standing beside her grandmother, felt something tighten in her chest, not quite anger, but close to it. The particular frustration of watching a decision get made about something you'd started, quietly, to hope for, made by a man who hadn't asked her opinion or anyone else's, simply announced it from a position of authority. Nobody in the crowd felt entitled to question aloud. Pay attention to this part, because it's easy to walk past. Mahanama never once said the words "I'm afraid." He said caution. He said safety. He said we don't know this man. Phrases that sounded, to every reasonable ear in that small crowd, like exactly the sort of prudent leadership a good headman ought to provide. Every frightened decision in Veludvara that week would be dressed carefully in the language of prudence, which is, if you think about it, exactly how fear usually dresses itself. In villages and in people both, it rarely announces itself honestly, rarely stands up and says simply, "I am afraid, and I don't know how to stop being afraid." It borrows the clothes of wisdom instead, and wears them so convincingly that even the person wearing them often can't tell the difference anymore. That evening, walking home from the gathering, Sona asked her grandmother the question that had been sitting in her since the announcement, turning it over on the short walk back to their hut with the particular persistence of someone who has decided a question matters and won't let it drop easily. How do you know who to trust if you've never even met the person? If all you have is what other people say about him, and everyone seems to be saying something different? Vadamata was quiet for a long moment, her granddaughter's question landing somewhere old and unresolved in her, close enough to the question that had haunted her own grandmother 60 years ago, that it made the old woman's chest tighten slightly. A small, familiar ache she'd learned to live alongside without ever quite resolving. You don't, not fully, Vadamata said finally, choosing her words with obvious care. Not from rumor, not from fear, either. Fear's just as unreliable as blind trust, maybe more so, since fear at least pretends to be caution, while blind trust doesn't even bother with the pretend. She paused, watching the last light fade from the grey sky above them. There's a kind of confidence that isn't the same as believing everything you're told. It's more like being willing to go find out for yourself and trusting your own eyes once you have, rather than borrowing someone else's fear or someone else's hope secondhand and calling it your own conclusion. There's a word for that kind of confidence, though neither of them had it yet, sitting there in the gathering dark outside their own small hut. The teachers of this era would eventually call it sadha, not blind faith, not credulous belief, but something closer to a provisional trust, held loosely, tested against your own experience rather than swallowed whole from someone else's certainty. Revisable the moment your own eyes told you something different. It was the same answer, roughly, that the wanderer himself would one day give to the confused people of Kesaputta, when they asked him the very question Bagu had been chewing on in the dark. Don't believe something simply because it's tradition, or because a text says so, or because an authority insists, or because everyone around you seems certain. Test it. See if it leads to less suffering or more, in your own life and in the lives of those around you. Trust what you find, and be willing to revise even that if better evidence eventually arrives. Sona didn't have the word sadha. She had something close enough, a decision made quietly, that she intended to go see for herself, gatestones or no gatestones. The moment there was any way to do so without causing her grandmother trouble, a resolve that sat in her chest that night like a small, steady flame, entirely unlike the fear that had settled, that same evening, over most of the rest of Veludvara. If any of this sounds familiar, the wanting to see for yourself instead of taking someone else's fear as your own, the small, stubborn insistence on finding things out firsthand rather than secondhand. The follow button just means you won't miss the rest of the walk to the gate, or what Sona, and eventually the rest of the village, actually found waiting there. Chapter 6. What Kutika owed. While Mahanama drew his line at the gatestones, Kutika was drawing a very different kind of line, inside himself in the dark, where nobody could see him do it, where the only witness to his private reckoning was the woman who had shared his bed and his troubles for 12 years, without ever once being allowed to share this particular one. He waited until the children were asleep before he said anything to his wife. They sat outside their hut in the cooling air, the way they often did after a hard day, the last of the evening's small fire burning low between them, casting just enough light to see each other's faces without illuminating much else. For a long while neither of them spoke. She had learned, over the years of their marriage, when to let a silence sit rather than crowd it, understanding by now the particular shape of her husband's silences, well enough to know when one of them was about to break open into something worth waiting for.
Megara wants the backfield,
Kutika said finally, the words coming out flatter than he'd intended. If I can't pay by week's end. His wife didn't answer right away either, absorbing this with the same careful patience she brought to most hard news. "How much?" she said. Not really a question, more an invitation, an opening to take or continue to avoid, as he'd been avoiding it for weeks now. He told her the number. It came out smaller than he'd expected somehow, once it was finally spoken aloud into the cooling evening air, as if the weight of it had lived mostly in the not saying. In the elaborate architecture of avoidance he'd built around a handful of syllables, and once said, it simply became a fact among other facts, a real and solvable problem, instead of a shapeless dread he'd been carrying around for weeks like a stone, lodged somewhere behind his ribs. His wife was quiet for a moment, absorbing it, doing her own quick calculations against what little they had put aside, and then, to his surprise, though perhaps it shouldn't have surprised him, after 12 years, reached over and took his hand. "That's not nothing," she said, her fingers warm and steady around his. "But it's not the end of everything either. We'll find a way, or we'll lose the field and find another way after that. Either way, you don't have to carry the number alone anymore. You never did. You just decided you had to somewhere along the way, without ever asking me if I wanted to help carry it." Something in Kutika's chest, which had been clenched tight for weeks, tight enough that he'd started to notice it even in his sleep, loosened. Not all the way, not enough to solve anything practical. The field was still, in all likelihood, still going to Megara by week's end regardless of how many hands were now aware of the number. But enough that he could breathe a little easier sitting there in the dark beside her. Enough that the particular tightness behind his ribs eased by some small but noticeable degree. Grief has a strange shape sometimes. It doesn't always look like tears, doesn't always announce itself with the drama a person might expect. Sometimes it looks like a man finally saying a number out loud after weeks of choking on it, and discovering that the saying itself, even without a solution attached, was most of the weight he'd been carrying all along. Let that settle before we go on, because it matters more than it might seem to right now. Shame thrives specifically in silence, feeds on it, grows larger in the dark than it ever could in the light of a shared conversation. The debt hadn't changed size at all in the telling. The number was exactly the same number it had been that morning, exactly the same number it would be tomorrow. What changed was that Kutika was no longer alone with it, and that turned out to matter more than he could have predicted. Sitting in his field that morning, with Gosaka's polite, unbearable news still ringing in his ears. Later that same night, after the fire had burned down and his wife had finally drifted to sleep beside him, Kutika lay awake a while longer, turning the evening over. He found himself thinking, unexpectedly, of his own father, who had worked this same difficult field a generation before him, and had never, as far as Kutika knew, once admitted a hardship out loud to anyone. A man who had died still holding whatever private accounting of failure and shame he'd carried, never once setting it down the way Kutika had just set his own down at his wife's feet. He didn't know, lying there in the dark, whether his father's silence had been strength or simply a different, quieter kind of the same fear that had kept Kutika's own mouth shut for weeks. He suspected, turning it over, that it had probably been both at once, that the two were harder to tell apart in practice than anyone liked to admit. He thought too of Megara, a man he'd always assumed simply had more than enough, and therefore nothings, and wondered, for the first time, whether that assumption had ever actually been true, or whether it was just easier to believe a man with a full storehouse had no fears worth naming. He fell asleep eventually, the debt still unsolved, the field's fate still hanging in the balance, but something in him lighter than it had been in weeks, the particular lightness of a burden, finally shared rather than a burden resolved. His wife, for her part, lay awake a while after he finally drifted off, her hand still resting where his had been, thinking her own private thoughts about the marriage they'd built together. 12 years of shared hardship that had taught her, if nothing else, that the weight of a thing shared, honestly, was almost always more bearable than the same weight carried in silence. A lesson she wished, not for the first time, that her husband had learned a little sooner, a little further up the hill, in a house considerably larger than Kutika's, with a proper storeroom for grain and a second room besides the main one. Megara sat over his ledgers by lamplight, tallying figures with the particular focus of a man who found columns of numbers more soothing than most people found silence, more reliable, certainly, than the uncertain business of human relationships. He wasn't a cruel man, not by his own accounting of himself, and mostly not by the village's accounting of him either, just a careful one, methodical, the kind who slept better when he knew exactly what he owned and exactly what was owed to him, down to the smallest measure of grain. What almost nobody in Veludvara knew about Megara, because he'd never told anyone, and it had happened before most of the current villagers were born, was that his own family had once lost everything. A single bad decade, 2 generations back, a string of failed harvests compounded by a dispute over water rights that had gone badly and permanently, had stripped his grandfather of land, animals, and standing, reducing a once respected family to something to the bottom of the village's quiet, unspoken hierarchy. Megara had grown up hearing the story told and retold as a kind of family scripture, recited at gatherings and in private moments alike. This is what happens when you don't hold tightly enough to what's yours. This is what carelessness costs a family, for generations after the carelessness itself is forgotten. He had spent his whole adult life making certain it never happened to him. Land, grain stores, always more than the household could possibly need in a single season. Debts owed to him rather than by him, a careful ledger of obligations that meant, in practice, that half the village owed him something, however small. Each acquisition felt, in the moment of acquiring it, like safety, one more brick in a wall against a version of ruin he'd never personally experienced, but had been raised to fear more than almost anything else. More than illness, more than loss, more even than his own eventual death. There's a word the old teachers would use for that particular kind of hunger. Not greed, exactly, though it could look like greed from the outside, could look exactly like the cold calculation villagers sometimes accused him of in whispered conversations he was never meant to overhear. Tangha, thirst, the specific ache of believing that just a little more, one more field, one more year's grain stored against disaster, one more debt collected and secured, might finally be enough to feel safe. Might finally quiet the old family scripture playing on some endless loop in the back of his mind. It never quite was. Megara had more land now than his grandfather had ever owned, more stored grain than 3 ordinary households would need in a hard year. And he still checked his ledgers by lamplight most nights, unable to fully rest, unable to quite believe that the numbers, however favorable, were finally enough. That's not an excuse for what the debt would cost Kutika, if it came to that. A family's field, a livelihood built over generations, handed over to satisfy one careful man's endless need for more security than any single life could actually require. It's just the fuller shape of the man holding the debt, frightened in his own particular way, armored in numbers instead of pride, still, somehow not entirely at peace even with everything he'd built, sitting alone in a large house with more grain than he could eat, checking figures that never quite added up to the safety he was actually looking for. Kutika didn't know any of that about Megara, and probably wouldn't have cared much if he had, not with his own family's field on the line and his own children's next season's food hanging in the balance. But the story of Veludvara that week was turning out to be, underneath everything else, A story about several different men, each convinced that his own particular fear was simply good sense. Mahanama's caution, Kutika's silence, Megara's accumulation, Kanda's iron-hard practicality, and none of them yet able to see how similar their private fears actually were to each other's. How each man's particular armor was built from the same raw material as every other man's, just shaped differently by whatever wound had demanded it first. Chapter 7. The man past the boundary stone's grief has a way of making a person notice other grief nearby that they'd trained themselves not to see. The way an ache in one part of the body can suddenly make you aware of a dozen smaller aches you'd been ignoring for weeks. And so it was. The morning after Kutika finally said his number out loud, that his eyes happened to land. Really land. For the first time in longer than he could remember, on the thin trail of smoke rising from just past the boundary stones, where a man named Panduka lived alone. Almost nobody in Veludvara went near Panduka's hut. Children were told stories to keep them away, vague, frightening stories about sickness and bad luck, embellished over the years into something closer to a folk tale than an honest account of one man's misfortune. The kind of stories adults tell when they don't want to explain the real reason for a rule, when the actual explanation feels too uncomfortable to hand to a child. The real reason, if anyone had bothered to say it plainly, was simpler and sadder than any story. Years ago, Panduka had fallen ill with something that left marks on his skin the village didn't understand, and was too frightened to ask questions about. Marks that spread slowly over months, in a way that terrified everyone who saw them, without ever once being explained by anyone with actual knowledge of such things. And rather than sit with that fear, rather than do the harder work of learning what the illness actually was, and whether it posed any real danger to anyone else, Veludvara had done what frightened villages have done in every era, everywhere, when faced with something they didn't understand and didn't want to. It had moved the frightening thing to the edge of what it could see, and agreed, without ever quite saying so out loud, in any single conversation anyone could point to afterward, to stop counting him. Food was left for him sometimes, at a careful distance, by whoever felt guilty enough that week to make the walk. Usually one of the older women, moved by some combination of pity and old-fashioned decency that hadn't quite been extinguished by years of collective avoidance. Nobody visited beyond that. Nobody spoke to him directly if it could be helped, and it could almost always be helped, given enough determination to avoid it. He had become, over the years, less a person to the village and more a fact about the landscape. The man past the stones, spoken of the way you might say, the rock by the river, or the dead tree on the hill, a fixed feature of the geography, rather than a man with a name and a history and a life that had once, before all this, looked much like anyone else's. There's a detail here easy to miss if you're moving quickly through a story like this. Ugga, another villager, watched Kutika's gaze drift toward that thin trail of smoke that morning, and felt something shift in his own chest that he hadn't expected, a small unwelcome recognition rising up before he could stop it. Ugga had his own quiet history with the village's particular talent for uncounting people. Years back, after a dispute over land that had gone badly and publicly, a boundary argument with a neighbor that had escalated, over one bad season, into something uglier than either man had intended, and after a temper he wasn't proud of, that had gotten the better of him more than once during that dispute, said in anger things he'd never quite been able to take back. The village had gradually, informally, stopped including him in things. Not exiled, not officially, nothing so clean or so easily named as that. Just slowly left off invitations to gatherings that used to include him automatically. Slowly spoken to less at the well, conversations trailing off a beat too soon when he approached. Slowly made to understand, through 1,000 small omissions that no single person could be blamed for. and that added up, over years, to something that felt very much like being erased, that he existed at the edges of Veludvara's attention rather than its center, tolerated rather than welcomed. He recognized what had happened to Panduka, because a milder version of it had happened to him, and watching Katika notice the smoke that morning, Ugga found himself walking, almost without deciding to, toward the boundary stones. Not all the way to Panduka's hut, not yet. Some old caution still holding him back from that final distance, but closer than he'd been in years. Close enough that the walk itself felt like crossing some private threshold he hadn't fully examined before taking the first step. He stopped a good distance off, close enough to see the shape of the man sitting outside his hut in the morning light, doing something with his hands, mending a torn cloth. It looked like, slow and careful, the unhurried work of a man with nothing but time and very little else. Panduka didn't look up. Maybe he hadn't noticed Ugga standing there, absorbed as he was in his mending. Maybe he had, and had simply stopped expecting anyone who came that close to actually keep coming, had learned, over years of near approaches that never became actual visits, not to invest any hope in the sight of a distant figure near the boundary. Something in Ugga hardened, in that moment, into a kind of resolve he didn't yet have words for. Standing there at a careful distance, watching a man mend a cloth in the morning sun. Not despair, he'd carried enough of that himself over the years to recognize it clearly when it showed up, and this wasn't that. It was closer to a decision forming, quietly, underneath conscious thought, the way real decisions often form long before the person making them notices they've been made. That whatever this village decided about the wanderer coming down the road, Ugga had just seen something in Panduka's stillness that looked uncomfortably like a mirror, a reflection of his own smaller, softer exile that he hadn't let himself look at quite this directly in years. Ugga didn't approach Panduka's hut that day, in the end. He stood at his careful distance for a long while, watching the other man's hands move steadily over the mending, and then turned and walked back toward the village, the resolve that had hardened in him still unspoken, still unacted upon, but no longer entirely dormant either. He thought, walking back, about the specific afternoon years ago, when the argument over the boundary line had gone wrong, the words he'd said in anger, the way his own neighbor's face had changed in that moment, the slow years afterward of being spoken to a little less, invited a little less, until he'd simply stopped expecting to be included in things, and the village had simply stopped offering. He had told himself, for years, that this was simply how the village was, an impersonal weather he had no particular power to change. Watching Panduka mend a cloth in the morning sun, he wondered, for the first time in longer than he could say, whether that story he told himself had ever actually been true, or whether it was simply easier than admitting that a village is made of individual people, each one capable, on any given day, of walking a little closer instead of staying a little further. He didn't act on the thought that day, but he carried it home with him. The way a person carries an ember that hasn't yet caught anything on fire, waiting only for the right dry moment. He passed, on his way back, the well where the boundary dispute with his neighbor had first begun to sour all those years ago, and found himself looking at it differently than he had in a long while. Not as the site of an old wound, but simply as a well, ordinary and unremarkable, the way it must have looked to him before the argument had ever happened at all. Word had it. Nobody quite remembered where the story originated. The way village stories rarely have a traceable source once they've passed through enough retellings. That Panduka hadn't always been this alone. That before the illness, before the marks on his skin, he'd been an ordinary man with an ordinary place in Veludvara, married once, some said. Though nobody was quite certain anymore whether that detail was true or simply something the story had accumulated over the years, the way a stone gathers moss. The kind of unremarkable belonging most people never think to be grateful for until it's gone, until they watch someone else lose it and realize, with an uncomfortable jolt, how thin the membrane actually is between belonging and not. What had actually happened to him, the fuller story, the reason the illness had cost him not just his health, but every single relationship he'd once had. The precise sequence of fear and avoidance and gradual abandonment that had turned a sick man into a fact about the landscape remained, for now, something the village held in fragments, half-guessed, never confirmed. Each person who mentioned him at all offering a slightly different, slightly incomplete version, none of them quite matching, none of them quite willing to sit with the full discomfort of what their collective choice had actually cost one man. There's a reason this stuck with people for years afterward. Once the whole story of that week finally came out in full, once enough of the fragments had finally been assembled into something like a complete account. But we'll get to that part later. For now, all that mattered was this: a man alone passed the boundary stones, mending a torn cloth in the morning light, unaware that two separate villagers, Kutika, still raw from his own night of finally speaking a hard truth out loud. The ache of that admission still fresh enough to have opened something in him he hadn't expected. And Uga, carrying his own quieter version of the same exile, had each, in their own way on this particular ordinary morning, just started to see him, really see him, for what felt like the first time in years. Karuna is the word the old teachers would use for what was beginning to stir in both of these men, though neither would have named it that. Standing there in the morning light with their own private histories of loss and shame pressing against a stranger's isolation. Compassion, not the abstract kind, not pity felt safely from a distance, the kind that lets you feel something for someone's suffering, while making absolutely certain to never get close enough to actually do anything about it. But the specific, uncomfortable kind that makes you actually walk closer to someone else's suffering, instead of further away from it. That makes you willing to risk your own comfort for the sake of another person's. It rarely arrives fully formed, rarely announces itself with any dramatic clarity. It usually starts exactly like this: a longer look than usual at a trail of smoke you'd trained yourself not to notice. A few extra steps taken toward a boundary you'd normally have kept. This is the part of the story that doesn't get told as often. When people talk about wandering teachers and villages that change, when the story gets simplified down to its most dramatic beats and loses the quieter moments that actually made the dramatic beats possible, it's not the arrival at the gate, it's this: the quiet, unremarkable morning when two ordinary flawed men, each carrying their own private griefs, each other still armored in different ways against the world, each took one small step towards someone the whole village had agreed to stop seeing, worth sitting with, worth a like if it's landing. Chapter 8. One day out, one day left. And on that last ordinary morning, two very different farmers crossed paths, separately, without either one knowing about the other, on the road out of Veludvara, each carrying their own private weight toward the same unremarkable stretch of dirt and shade. Kutika had walked out past the fields before sunrise, restless in the particular way a man gets when a problem is partly solved and partly still hanging over him. The relief of having finally spoken his number out loud, sitting alongside the unchanged reality that the field itself was, in all likelihood, still going to Migara by week's end. There was a version of walking that helped with that feeling, and a version of sitting still that didn't. And Kutika, that morning, needed his feet moving under him more than he needed anything else. He came upon the wanderers' small group resting at the edge of the road, in the shade of a stand of trees, before he even realized who they were, having half forgotten in his own preoccupation that the group was expected to pass this way at all. He almost turned back, some old instinct toward caution rising up automatically at the sight of strangers camped by the road. But something tiredness mostly, and a kind of blunt curiosity that had crept up on him, without his noticing over these past several days, fed by Ravata's stories and the wheel-fixing tale, and Sona's quiet questions that had somehow made their way to him second-hand, made him stay at a distance and watch instead. A local farmer, someone Kutika didn't recognize, a man from perhaps one of the neighboring villages, had stopped to speak with the wanderer, and it was clear from the man's posture, arms crossed, chin jutted forward, feet planted wide in the stance of someone spoiling for an argument, that he hadn't come to be taught anything. He'd come to argue, to test, maybe to prove something to himself about the foolishness of wandering teachers and the people credulous enough to follow them. "You don't plough," the farmer said, loud enough to carry across the small clearing. "You don't sow. You don't work a field a single day of your life, and yet you eat same as the rest of us, who actually earn our bread. Explain to me what gives you the right." The wanderer didn't seem offended by the question. If anything, he looked mildly interested in it, the way a person looks interested in a genuinely good question, rather than an insult dressed as one. Leaning forward slightly as though the farmer had offered him something worth examining, rather than an attack to be defended against. "I do plough," he said, his voice even, unhurried. "And I do sow." The farmer's arms stayed crossed, unconvinced, clearly expecting evasion and prepared to press further. "Where's your field then? Where's your ox? Where's your... I don't see any of it." "Faith is the seed I sow," the wanderer said, "and mindfulness is the plough I use to turn the ground, so the seed can take root, instead of scattering uselessly on hard soil. Same as any seed scattered without preparation. Diligence is the ox that pulls it. Steady, unglamorous work that most people never see because it happens quietly, day after day. Wisdom is the yoke and the goad, the thing that keeps the ox moving in a useful direction, instead of wandering wherever its own momentum happens to carry it. And what grows from all of that isn't grain, exactly. It's the end of suffering, which I'd argue feeds a person more completely than any harvest ever has. Though I'll grant you freely that it won't fill your stomach the way your barley does, won't feed your children tonight the way a good crop would. I'm not claiming my field replaces yours, only that it's a field and I do work it, every single day, the same as you work yours, with the same patience and the same uncertainty about whether this particular season's effort will actually yield anything worth having. The farmer didn't answer right away, some of the challenge draining visibly out of his crossed arms and jutted chin. Kutika, watching from a distance, found himself unexpectedly moved by the exchange. Not because the wanderer had won some kind of debate, exactly, scored some clever point that left the other farmer visibly defeated, but because of how ordinary the metaphor was, how completely it avoided the lofty, unreachable language Kutika had half expected from a man people were already calling remarkable up and down the road. A field, a plough, an ox, things Kutika understood in his bones, in his aching back, in his cracked and calloused hands that had spent this entire dry season fighting a losing battle against ground that refused to cooperate. This wasn't some untouchable holy man speaking a language built to keep ordinary people out. The kind of deliberately obscure wisdom that made Kutika feel small and ignorant every time he'd encountered it before. This was a man talking about faith the exact same way Kutika talked about barley, as something you tend, patiently, day after day, with no guarantee of the outcome, because tending it is simply what you do, because the alternative, not tending it at all, guarantees nothing but certain failure. It didn't look like much. It wasn't nothing. Bhavana, the old teachers would later call it, cultivation, the deliberate, patient growing of a quality, the way you'd grow anything worth growing. Not a lightning strike of transformation that arrives all at once, and changes everything overnight, but a season of tending, of small consistent effort accumulated over time until something worth harvesting finally emerges. Kutika didn't have the word, he had the image though, the plough and the ox and the seed, and the image was enough to sit with him for the rest of that day, and well into the next, turning itself over in his mind, the way he might turn over a particularly good piece of advice from an older, more experienced farmer. The farmer who had argued with the wanderer stood a while after the exchange ended, still turning the conversation over, his crossed arms having long since dropped to his sides. He hadn't come away agreeing with everything the wanderer had said. Some stubborn part of him still insisted that a field of actual barley mattered more than any field of faith, whatever fine words were used to describe it. But he found, walking away, that he couldn't quite muster the same contempt he'd arrived with, that the wanderer's calm, unhurried answer had done something to the argument he'd prepared that he hadn't expected and couldn't easily undo. Kutika, watching this farmer walk off down his own separate path, understood something, in that moment, that he wouldn't have been able to put into words if asked. That the wanderer didn't seem particularly invested in winning anyone over, in collecting agreement the way a merchant collects coin. He simply answered honestly, and let the answer do whatever work it was going to do in whoever happened to be listening, without any visible need to control the outcome. There was something restful in that, Kutika thought, turning it over as he continued his own walk home. He found himself, walking on, comparing that quiet confidence to Megara's. The steward's careful politeness, the ledgers checked nightly by lamplight, all of it aimed at a security that never seemed to arrive, no matter how much was accumulated. Two very different men, he thought, each convinced his own approach to an uncertain world was the wiser one. Kutika wasn't sure yet which of them was right, but for the first time in weeks, he found he could hold the question lightly, without it settling into his chest like a stone. Not far down the same road, an hour or so later, Yasa, Mahanama's son, finally reached the end of the errand his mother had sent him on 2 days before, checking in on his great-aunt Bada, who lived alone at the far edge of the neighboring village, and had taken a fall that spring, from which she'd never fully recovered. He'd put the visit off longer than he should have, telling himself the wanderer's arrival had simply crowded his week, though if he was honest with himself, the truth was closer to dread. Bada had always been sharp-tongued and harder still to comfort, and Yasa had never known what to say to an old woman, who spent most of her days now simply waiting to see whether her body would recover any further, or had already finished doing what recovering it was going to do. He found her sitting up, at least, propped against the wall of her hut, with a bowl of rice untouched beside her, and when he asked, out of the same habit of politeness that got him through most difficult conversations, whether she needed anything, she surprised him by answering honestly instead of waving him off the way she usually did. "Someone to sit with me who isn't counting the minutes," she said. That would help more than the rice. So he sat longer than he'd planned to, and let her talk about a husband 30 years dead, and a harvest from her girlhood that had apparently been the best anyone in the region had ever seen, and found, walking home afterward, that the visit had cost him almost nothing, and had plainly been the best part of her week. A small, unglamorous kindness that had needed nothing from him except the willingness to stay a little longer than the errand strictly required. He said nothing to his father about any of it when he got home, the habit of silence between them well established by now. Though this time what he was keeping mind quiet had nothing to do with the wanderer at all, but something in him had shifted a little further anyway, not a decision yet, nothing so definite as that, nothing he could have named or defended if pressed, just a widening crack, the kind that doesn't announce itself with any single dramatic moment, just accumulates, quietly, one glimpse at a time, one small observation stacked on top of the last, until eventually, though neither Yasa nor anyone else could have said exactly when, the crack would widen enough to let something through. There's something worth understanding here about how the body, any body, human or communal, responds to a threat that turns out not to be one. For months, without quite naming it that way, without any single person in Veludvara sitting down and consciously deciding to be braced, the whole village had been braced against the drought, watching the sky every single morning with the particular tension of people waiting for a blow that keeps not quite landing, braced against a wandering stranger who might be exactly the kind of trouble that had cost Mahanama's father his standing 30 years before, a threat that existed, for most of the village, entirely in imagination and inherited caution rather than any actual evidence. That bracing has a cost, and it's not just emotional, it's physical, measurable, the kind of thing that happens in a nervous system, whether the threat is a predator crouched in the grass, or a rumor carried down a dusty road by a talkative grain merchant. The body keeps preparing to run or fight, long after the actual danger, if there ever was one, has passed or never existed at all. Muscles staying tensed, breath staying shallow, sleep staying thin and unrestful. And the release of that bracing, when it finally comes, the moment a body or a village finally senses it's safe enough to stop holding its breath, tends to feel, in the moment, almost as intense as the fear itself did, a flood of sensation that can be disorienting in its own right. Sometimes it comes out as tears, sudden and unexpected. Sometimes as unexpected laughter, equally sudden. Sometimes, as it would for Kutika, it simply comes out as a quiet, unremarkable feeling of being able to breathe a little easier while walking home along a dusty road, turning a stranger's metaphor about seeds and plows over and over in his mind, discovering that some of the weight he'd been carrying without quite realizing it had, somewhere along that walk, gotten a little lighter. Keep this in the back of your mind, because it'll matter again before this story ends. Bodies remember safety the same careful, gradual way they remember danger. Neither one arrives all at once, in a single overwhelming flood. Both take tending, take time, take small repeated evidence accumulated patiently until the nervous system, finally, cautiously, agrees to believe what the evidence has been suggesting all along. Chapter 9. The night before the gate. By nightfall, half the village had quietly changed its mind about something, even if no one had said so out loud yet, and even if most of them hadn't fully admitted it to themselves, sitting with a shift in feeling they couldn't quite name or explain even in the privacy of their own thoughts. Vadamata sat by her fire that evening with a small circle of children gathered close, Sona among them, though she was really too old now for bedtime stories, staying anyway out of something between habit and affection, and, if she was honest with herself, a reluctance to be anywhere else while her grandmother was in one of her storytelling moods. Tissa and Nandini had wandered over too, drawn, the way children always are, to an old woman's fire and the promise of a story, their mother Suja sitting nearby with some mending in her lap, glad for a moment of quiet after another long day, of stretching too little food across too many hungry hours, grateful too for the simple pleasure of watching her children's faces lit by firelight, absorbed in something other than the low, constant worry that had colored most of their days this season. "Tell the one about the storm," Nandini said, settling into her grandmother's lap. Though Vadamata wasn't actually her grandmother, just the kind of old woman every child in a small village ends up borrowing as one, claimed by half the village's children as some version of family regardless of actual bloodline. Vadamata smiled, the firelight catching the deep lines of her face, carving them into something almost golden in the flickering light, and began the way she always began, slow, unhurried. as if the story had all the time in the world to arrive, as if nothing waited for it, and nothing would be lost by taking the long way there. Long ago, she said, in a forest not so different from the one past our gate, a storm came up fast, the kind that catches every creature by surprise, wind tearing branches loose, rain coming sideways so hard it stung. And a small animal, caught far from its den, found itself running with nowhere left to run, until it came upon a stranger's shelter, another creature entirely, one it had never met, one it had every reason to fear, because in ordinary times these two were not friends, were in fact the kind of creatures who usually kept a careful distance from each other, who might, on any other day, have been predator and prey rather than two frightened creatures caught in the same storm. What kind of animal? Tissa asked, drawn in despite himself, leaning forward slightly, with the particular attentiveness he usually reserved for watching the road for signs of trouble. That depends on who's telling it, Vodamata said, which was true, and also the kind of answer old women give when they want a story to shape itself around whatever fears and hopes the listener happened to be carrying that particular night. But the shelter creature didn't turn the stranger away, didn't ask what it wanted, or whether it deserved help, or whether helping was safe, whether the old rules about who belonged with whom still applied in the middle of a storm this fierce. It simply made room, pressed itself against the far wall of its own den, and let the frightened, soaked, exhausted stranger in out of the storm, expecting nothing back for it. Not thanks, not payment, not even the certainty that the stranger wouldn't turn on it once the storm had passed and the old rules, whatever they were, resumed their ordinary claim on both of them. Did it turn on it? Nandini asked, wide-eyed, the way children ask questions when they already suspect they know the shape of the answer, but need to hear it said anyway, need the confirmation that the world can, sometimes, be kinder than it has to be. No, Vadamata said, her voice soft and certain. They both simply waited out the storm together, in the dark, two creatures who had every reason to be afraid of each other and found, instead, that fear wasn't actually required, not in that particular den on that particular night. And when the storm passed and the sun came back, they each went their own way again, back to their ordinary lives, their ordinary distance from each other. But something had changed between them that never fully went back to what it had been before, some small knowledge, carried by each of them separately, that the old fear hadn't been the whole truth after all. The fire popped and settled, sending a small shower of sparks briefly upward before they faded into the dark. Sujata, listening from a few feet away, her mending forgotten in her lap, found herself thinking of nothing in particular and everything at once, of her husband still somewhere on the road, of the wanderer somewhere on that same road, of storms and strangers, and the particular ache of a species that spends so much of its time deciding who deserves shelter and who doesn't. Drawing lines that feel, in the moment, like simple good sense, and that look, from just a little distance, like something considerably smaller and more frightened than good sense. Here's what a story like this one teaches, without ever saying so directly. Children learn what mercy looks like long before they learn the word for it. Usually from exactly this kind of story, told at exactly this kind of fire, by exactly this kind of old woman who has outlived enough of her own fear to tell it without flinching, who has, in her own long life, carried enough regret about a door not open to know precisely why a story about an open door matters. After the story ended, and Nandini had finally drifted to sleep against her grandmother's shoulder, Tissa lingered by the fire a while longer, turning the storm story over with the particular seriousness he brought to most things. "Would you have let the stranger in?" he asked his mother, who had been quiet through most of the telling. "If it was you, if it was our den." Sujata considered the question carefully, understanding that her son was really asking something larger than the story itself, something closer to whether the world could be trusted at all, a question he'd been quietly carrying since that bad year 2 winters back. "I'd like to think so," she said finally. "I know it's easier to say that sitting by a warm fire than it would be to actually do it, in the middle of an actual storm, with an actual stranger at the door. But I'd like to think so." Tissa considered this answer with the same seriousness he'd asked the question, and didn't respond right away, and Sujata, watching her son's face in the firelight, wondered whether some small part of the storm story's lesson had actually managed to land in him, whether the particular caution the bad year had taught him might eventually make room for something like trust again, the way the shelter creature had made room for its frightened, soaked visitor. Nandini, half asleep already, murmured something none of them quite caught, a small, drowsy sound of contentment rather than any actual word. And Sujata gathered her closer, grateful, in that ordinary moment, for a daughter who hadn't yet learned to need convincing that shelter could be trusted, and quietly hopeful that whatever this particular week brought to Veludvara might let her stay that way a little longer than the world usually allowed. Past the boundary stones, in the dark, Panduka heard something he hadn't heard in a long time, singing. Faint, distant, carried on the still night air from the field beyond the gate, where the wanderers' small group had settled for the evening. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even strictly speaking, a performance meant for any particular audience. Just monks chanting quietly among themselves, the ordinary evening practice of men who did this every night, regardless of who was listening, regardless of whether anyone at all happened to be within earshot. Panduka sat very still outside his hut for a long moment, listening, his mending forgotten in his lap, the needle still threaded through the half-finished cloth. He couldn't remember the last time a sound from outside his own small world had drawn him toward it, instead of making him flinch further back into the dark, further into the small, familiar safety of his own hut, where at least nothing could disappoint him further. For years now, sound from the village direction had meant one of two things. Either it had nothing to do with him at all, ordinary village noise, drifting past his isolation without ever touching it, or it was children daring each other to get close enough to his boundary to be scared, laughing and running before he could even respond, before he could even manage the small dignity of pretending not to have heard them. This was different. This sound wasn't happening near him or at him. It simply existed, indifferent to whether he listened or not, unconcerned with his presence one way or the other. And something about that indifference, the fact that it wasn't performing for him, wasn't avoiding him either, wasn't shaped in any way by his own existence at all, made it safe in a way almost nothing had felt safe to Panduka in years. A sound that asked nothing of him and offered, simply by continuing steadily through the dark, something close to an invitation. He stood, slowly, joints protesting the movement after so many years of careful stillness, of a body that had learned to move as little as possible, to take up as little space and attract as little attention as it could manage, and took a step toward the sound. Then another. Something had been loosened in him, even if he couldn't have named what, or when, or why tonight specifically was the night his feet finally carried him a few steps closer to a sound instead of further away from it. Why this particular evening, after so many identical evenings of careful isolation, had finally offered him enough safety to risk moving towards something unfamiliar. No one had ordered this village to open its gates, and no single authority had commanded anyone's compliance. Fear hadn't vanished overnight either, the way a sudden rain finally breaks a drought that has dragged on for months, and Veludvara hadn't arrived all at once, at some tidy collective agreement that the wanderer was safe to welcome. What was actually happening was smaller and slower than any of that. Enough people, one at a time, in their own separate corners of the dark, choosing to walk a little closer to something they didn't fully understand yet. A child staying up too late for a story about shelter. A man standing at a distance from a hut he'd normally have avoided. An old woman finally willing to remember out loud what she'd kept silent for 60 years. A sick man taking one slow step toward a sound he had every reason to expect would hurt him, and somehow instead didn't. We're close to the gate now. Before we get there, has there ever been a moment in your own life when you moved towards something you'd spent years avoiding? Not because you were certain it was safe, but because some small part of you had simply grown tired of running from it, tired of the particular exhaustion that comes from bracing against something for so long. Tell me what it was, if you're willing to share even a small piece of it. Chapter 10. The gate morning came the way mornings do, ordinary, grey at the edges, and by the time the sun cleared the tree line, the wanderers' small group was standing at the gate stones of Veludvara, exactly where Mahanama had said they could stand, and not one step further, arriving with none of the drama the village's imagination had, over the past several days, built up around this exact moment. They didn't push, they didn't ask twice, didn't send word ahead, requesting a formal reconsideration of the boundary Mahanama had drawn, didn't seem, in fact, to regard the boundary as any particular insult at all. The wanderer simply set down what little he carried in the field just beyond the boundary, a bowl, a robe, nothing more. The modest possessions of a man who had long ago decided that carrying less meant fearing less. And his monks did the same, and within a short while a small, quiet camp had assembled itself with the unhurried efficiency of men who had done this in 100 other villages, and expected nothing different here, no better welcome and no worse. Ananda moved among the handful of travelers who'd gathered at the edges of the field, some curious villagers keeping a careful distance, watching from just inside the gate stones with the particular mixture of curiosity and wariness that had characterized most of Veludvara's response so far. A few travelers passing through on the road who'd stopped when they saw the gathering, drawn by the same rumors that had reached the village days before, offering water, a kind word, the ordinary attentiveness that seemed to follow him everywhere without any visible effort, as natural to him as breathing. It was Ananda who noticed Panduka first. The man had come closer in the night than anyone realized. Close enough that by morning he was sitting at the very edge of the monks' camp, apart from the others but no longer entirely apart from anything. Present in a way he hadn't been present to anything beyond his own hut in longer than he could accurately remember. Nobody had invited him specifically, nobody had turned him away, either, which for Panduka amounted to nearly the same thing as an invitation, given how long it had been since anyone had simply let him remain somewhere without comment, without a flinch, without the careful, deliberate distance the rest of the village had trained itself to maintain around him. Ananda brought him water without making anything of it. No lingering, no visible pity, no question about the marks on his skin that the whole village had spent years flinching from, that Panduka himself had learned to expect every stranger's eyes to find first and dwell on longest. Just water, offered the same way it was offered to everyone else that morning, in the same cup, with the same brief, easy nod. And then Ananda moved on to the next person, as if a man like Panduka being present at all wasn't a thing that required any particular reaction, any special handling, any acknowledgement beyond the ordinary courtesy owed to any thirsty traveler. A handful of other travelers who'd stopped at the camp that morning, curious at the gathering, watched Ananda's easy treatment of Panduka with their own quiet reactions. 1. A merchant's wife, passing through with her husband's caravan, found herself thinking of a cousin back in her own village who'd been treated much the same way after an illness had left its own visible marks on her, pushed gradually to the margins of family gatherings, spoken of in hushed, careful tones rather than spoken to directly. She hadn't thought of that cousin in years, hadn't let herself examine too closely her own part in that particular slow exclusion. Watching a stranger's monk offer water without a flicker of hesitation stirred something uncomfortable in her that she wasn't sure what to do with, and she found herself, later that day, resolving to write to that cousin when she finally reached home, a resolution she hadn't expected to make when she'd woken that morning. It's a small thing, easy to miss in a story crowded with larger turning points. A traveler passing through, changed in some private way by 5 minutes of watching a stranger be kind. Carrying that change onward to a village, and a cousin this story will never actually visit. But it's worth remembering that whatever happened at the gatestones of Veludvara that week didn't stay contained to Veludvara alone. Kindness like that, witnessed even briefly, tends to travel further than the people who first offered it ever know. Mahanama watched all of this from just inside the gatestones, close enough to see clearly, far enough to maintain the boundary he'd drawn 2 days before, standing in the exact spot he'd chosen for this purpose, arms crossed, jaw set in the expression he'd worn for most of the past 2 days. He saw Panduka sitting there, near the fire, unafraid, unashamed, accepting water from a stranger's hand the way any ordinary person accepts water, without the careful, downcast posture Panduka usually adopted around anyone from the village proper. And something in Mahanama's chest, already loosened slightly by 2 sleepless nights of half-examined thought, cracked a little further, a fracture he hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. He hadn't looked directly at Panduka in years. Genuinely years. The kind of not looking that becomes so habitual, it stops feeling like a choice at all, and starts feeling simply like how things are, the way you stop noticing a familiar ache until something presses on it unexpectedly. Seeing him now, sitting easily among strangers who'd known him less than a day, treated with a casualness the village itself hadn't managed in years. Mahanama felt something uncomfortable rise in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. It sat somewhere close to shame, though it wasn't only that. There was something else tangled in with it, something closer to grief, for a decision the village had made so gradually and so collectively that no single person, including Mahanama himself, could point to the exact moment it had actually been decided. This is easy to walk past if you're not paying attention to what it actually took. The monks hadn't done anything dramatic, hadn't marched into the village issuing corrections, hadn't preached a sermon about compassion, or shamed the village for what it had done to Panduka, or made any kind of scene at all about the injustice sitting in plain view at the edge of their camp. They had simply treated a man like a man, without commentary, without fanfare, and in doing that plainly, they'd made visible something Veludvara had spent years arranging not to see, had accomplished more by simple, unremarkable kindness than any lecture could have managed. There's a discipline in that kind of patience, the discipline of men who could have been met with suspicion, with a closed gate, with a headman's careful line drawn in the dirt, and had responded to none of it with anything but stillness, with the same unhurried, unoffended calm they brought to everything else. There's an old teaching, from later in the wanderer's life, about patience under far worse treatment than a cold welcome. A teaching that uses the image of a saw, of a man being cut apart limb from limb and asked to hold no ill will even then. Not because suffering doesn't matter, not because cruelty should simply be accepted without resistance, but because meeting cruelty with more cruelty only doubles the cruelty already loose in the world, without solving anything at all, without healing anything, without making the next encounter any easier for the next person who happens to receive it. Nobody at the gate stones of Veludvara that morning was being cut apart with a saw, but the same discipline, the same refusal to let someone else's fear dictate your own response, was quietly present in the monks' patience at a gate that hadn't opened for them, and might not open for days yet, if it opened at all, if Mahanama's careful line held as firmly as he'd intended it to. Patience like that is rarely loud. Virtue, in practice, hardly ever announces itself with any kind of fanfare, and the right thing to do often looks, from the outside, like almost nothing at all, until you understand what it actually cost to sit that still, that long, at a gate that hadn't opened yet. Nagasamala, meanwhile, moved quietly among the camp, doing the unglamorous work that never made it into any story told about this week. Mending a strap, checking the small store of supplies, making sure the old man whose cart they'd fixed 2 days back had enough for the remainder of his journey before sending him off with a quiet word. Nobody watching from the village noticed him particularly. He seemed, if anything, to prefer it that way, content to be the kind of presence that held things steady without ever needing to be seen doing it. Down the road that same morning, out of sight of the village and unknown to everyone waiting at the gate, a man named Nanda had reached a flooded crossing that hadn't been flooded when he'd left, 11 days back, with 2 companions and a load of grain to trade, a crossing that had, in his absence, swollen with rain that had apparently fallen somewhere upstream, though not cruelly, over Veludvara's own parched fields, an irony that would have struck him as almost unbearable if he'd had the energy left to feel much of anything beyond simple, road-worn exhaustion. The water was moving fast, brown and swollen, carrying debris that suggested the flooding had been recent and significant, though not, he judged, studying the current carefully, entirely impassable if he was careful. He stood at the edge of it, calculating, the way a man calculates when he's this close to home, and doesn't want to lose another day to a crossing that might clear by tomorrow, might not clear for a week, weighing the risk of the crossing against the growing ache of wanting simply to be home, to see his wife's face and his children's faces, and know, first-hand rather than through worry, that everything he'd left behind 11 days ago was still standing. He thought of Sujata and Tissa and small Nandini, and didn't yet know that a wanderer's small camp had settled into the field just beyond his own village's gate, or that his own family was, at this very moment, closer to something changing than they'd been in months, that the village he was working so hard to return to was, in his absence, quietly becoming a slightly different place than the one he'd left. His 2 traveling companions, brothers named Saba and Kunda, who'd come from a village further south, parted ways with him at the crossing itself, their own road home lying in the opposite direction. They'd walked together 11 days, split cooking duties and watched shifts without much need for discussion, and had settled, somewhere around the 4th or 5th day, into the easy, wordless companionship of men who trust each other's judgment without needing to test it constantly. Kunda clasped Nanda's forearm before they split at the fork in the road, an old traveller's farewell that meant more than the 2 words that usually accompanied it. "Safe water," he said, which was what men on that road said to each other instead of goodbye, a small blessing exchanged between strangers turned companions who might never travel the same stretch of road together again. "Safe water," Nanda answered, and meant it, thinking as he said it, of how strange it was that 11 days on a hard road with near strangers could leave a man feeling less alone than he had in longer than he cared to admit, and how little that particular kind of companionship ever got mentioned when people talked about what a trading trip was actually for. He'd left Veludvara, thinking only of the grain he needed to sell and the coin he needed to bring home. He hadn't expected the road itself to hand him something almost as valuable and considerably harder to carry in a sack. Saba and Kunda turned south, back toward their own fields and their own waiting families. And Nanda stood alone a moment at the fork, watching them go, before turning his own tired feet toward the flooded crossing and whatever waited for him on the far side of it. Somewhere back in Veludvara, the day was only beginning, and at the gate stones, nothing dramatic had happened yet. No confrontation, no miracle, no single moment anyone would later point to and say that's when it changed. That's the exact instant everything shifted. Just a village and a small camp of strangers, sitting on either side of an old boundary, each one quietly, cautiously, watching the other, each one, in their own way, waiting to see what the other would do first. Chapter 11. What Vadamata remembered. Every story in Veludvara that week had been leading, without anyone quite realizing it, back to one old woman and one old memory, threads that had seemed, on any given day, entirely separate. Kutika's debt, Mahanama's fear, Panduka's isolation, Sona's curiosity, all of them, it would turn out, converging finally on a single decision, that only one person in the village had the particular history to make. Vadamata had said nothing more about it since that first night, when she'd told Sona only the fragment, a stranger at the gate, a grandmother who'd turned him away, a guilt that had outlived her by 2 generations without ever once being fully explained, carried forward as a kind of inherited weight. Nobody had ever quite understood the full shape of. But sitting at the edge of the field that second morning, watching the small camp of monks from a careful distance, the smoke of their small fire rising thin and steady into the grey sky. Something in the old woman finally settled into a decision she'd apparently been circling for 60 years without knowing it, a decision that had been waiting, patient and unhurried, for exactly this particular morning to arrive. She found Sona near the house and said, simply, "Come with me. I want to tell you the rest of it before I do something about it." They sat together at the edge of the field, close enough to see the camp clearly, far enough that no one could overhear, the morning light catching the deep lines of Vadamata's face as she gathered herself for what she was finally, after 60 years, ready to say in full. "I was younger than you," she said, "when the stranger came. My grandmother was head woman then, in the way old women sometimes were in villages like this one, more by everyone's quiet deference than by any formal title, a kind of authority earned through decades of good judgment rather than granted by any ceremony. A man came to the gate at dusk, travel-worn, alone, asking only for water and a place to rest until morning. Nothing more than that. Water and a patch of ground. What did she say? She said the village had nothing to spare for a stranger it didn't know. Vadamata's voice had gone somewhere old and tired, worn smooth by 60 years of turning the same memory over and over. It wasn't even true. We had water. We always had water. That year, it was one of the good years, before the harder ones came later. She said it out of fear, not need. Fear of what strangers sometimes brought with them. Fear that had settled over the village after some earlier trouble. I never fully understood myself, being too young at the time to be told the whole of it. Fear that had nothing to do with that particular man at all, and everything to do with a story she'd been told once, about a different stranger, in a different year, who'd brought trouble to a different village, a story that had traveled from mouth to mouth until it had become, in her mind, indistinguishable from an actual prophecy about every stranger who might ever come after. What happened to him, the man at the gate? He walked on, Vadamata said, her eyes fixed on the small camp beyond the boundary stones, as if watching in some sense for the ghost of that earlier stranger to appear alongside the wanderer resting there now. Didn't argue, didn't curse us, the way you might expect. If you wanted this to be a story with a clean moral, a simple lesson about what happens when you turn away someone you shouldn't have, just picked up what little he carried and walked on, into the dark, toward the forest, without a single word of anger, without so much as a backward glance that anyone reported afterward. She was quiet a moment, the fire crackling faintly in the distance. My grandmother watched him go. Never told anyone what she felt watching him go, kept that particular grief entirely to herself for the rest of her life. But she talked about him quietly for the rest of her life, in these small, unguarded moments that would catch me off guard as a girl. Wondered, sometimes out loud, late at night, who he might have been, whether he'd made it wherever he was going, whether he'd found shelter somewhere else that night, or simply walked until exhaustion forced him to stop, whether just water, nothing more than that, might have changed something for him or for us, if she'd only given it. Sona sat with that for a long moment, the pieces settling into place with a weight she could feel in her own chest. "You think it might have been someone like him," she said finally, nodding toward the camp. "A teacher, someone who mattered." "I don't know," Vadamata said, her voice steady despite the weight of the admission. "I'll never know." That's the part that stayed with me the longest. Not knowing, and realizing, somewhere along the way, somewhere in these past 60 years of turning the story over, that the not knowing was never really the point. The point was that we had water to give, and didn't, out of fear that cost us nothing to overcome and everything to keep carrying. A fear that turned out, in the end, to cost far more than the risk it was meant to protect us from. Sona sat with the fuller story a while longer before either of them moved, turning something over of her own. "Do you think," she asked slowly, "that not knowing what happened to him, the stranger, I mean, made it harder for great-grandmother to let it go? If she'd known he was fine, or known he'd come to harm, maybe either one would have been easier to carry than never knowing at all." Vadamata considered this with the particular care she gave to questions her granddaughter asked that turned out to be sharper than they first appeared. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe the not knowing was never really the hardest part," whatever she told herself. Maybe the hardest part was simply that she'd had water to give, in her own hands, and chose not to give it. The stranger's fate afterward, whether it was good or bad, never actually changed the shape of her own choice that evening. I think, in the end, that's the part that actually kept her up at night, not the mystery, the choice. Sona turned this over, filing it away the way she filed away most of her grandmother's harder-won observations. Understanding, without quite being able to say why, that this particular piece of wisdom mattered more than most, that it would likely return to her, unbidden, at some future moment in her own life, when she found herself weighing a choice against its unknowable consequences. The two of them sat a while longer in the quiet that followed, neither feeling any particular need to fill it with more words. 60 years of silence, Vadamata thought, deserved at least a few minutes of a different kind of quiet before she asked her own tired legs to carry her the rest of the way to the gate. She stood slowly, joints protesting the way an old woman's joints do after too long sitting on the ground, and looked toward the gate stones, toward the small camp of strangers sitting patiently just beyond them, exactly where Mahanama had told them they could sit, and not one step further, exactly where they had remained, without complaint, for the better part of a full day now. "I'm not going to make my grandmother's choice twice in one family," she said, her voice carrying a quiet, unshakable resolve that Sona had rarely heard in her before. "Come with me if you want to." And so it was that Vadamata, not Mahanama, not Bargu, not anyone the village would have guessed, not the headman with his careful boundaries, or the priest with his practiced authority, but a frail, elderly woman who had carried an unfinished story for 60 years, became the first person from inside Veludvara to formally cross to the gate stones and speak the words that had been 60 years in the waiting. The walk from her house to the gate took only a few minutes, an ordinary distance she'd covered thousands of times over the course of her long life. and yet it felt, this particular morning, like the longest walk she'd ever taken, each step carrying the accumulated weight of 2 generations' worth of unspoken regret. "You're welcome here," she said to the wanderer directly, her voice steadier than she felt, though a careful listener might have caught the slight tremor underneath it. "Past the stones, inside. Whatever the village can offer, water, shade, a place to rest properly instead of a bare field, it's yours, for as long as you need it." I should have said this 60 years ago, to someone else who came asking for nothing more than exactly this. I'm saying it now, to you, because I'm not willing to carry that particular silence into a 3rd generation. The wanderer looked at her for a long moment, something gentle and unhurried in his expression, the look of a man who has been offered water before and understands exactly how much it can cost a person to offer it, especially after 60 years of not, especially when the offering comes wrapped in an old woman's confession of a debt she'd carried her entire adult life, without ever once being able to pay it forward. "Thank you," he said simply. "That's a kindness that costs something. Those are the only kindnesses that matter much. In the end, the easy kindnesses, the ones that cost nothing, are pleasant enough, but they don't change very much, in the giver or in the world." Sona stood beside her grandmother, and something in her chest swelled with a feeling she didn't yet have a word for. Pride maybe, or relief, or something closer to karuna itself. Compassion finally moving all the way from feeling into action, the way it had been trying to for days across half the village, without quite managing to cross the line until now, until one old woman had finally, after 60 years, taken the step her own grandmother never had. There's a study centuries later and a world away that would follow several hundred people for the better part of their entire adult lives, tracking every measurable thing researchers could think to track: income, health, achievement, ambition, career success, physical fitness, trying to determine once and for all, through decades of careful observation, what actually predicted a long, well-lived life. After decades of data, thousands of interviews conducted across multiple generations. Of the same families, the answer that emerged, again and again, with a consistency that surprised even the researchers who'd spent their careers studying it, wasn't wealth and wasn't fame and wasn't even physical health in any simple sense. It was the quality of a person's close relationships, how connected they felt, how safe they were, within a circle of people who would show up for them, who would answer honestly when things were hard, who would sit with them through difficulty, rather than at a careful, protective distance. Loneliness, the researchers found, was more dangerous to a long life than most of the health risks people spend their whole lives worrying about. More dangerous, in some measurable sense, than the accumulated damage of poor diet or lack of exercise. Belonging wasn't a nice extra on top of a good life. It was very nearly the whole engine of one. Vadamata never read that study, obviously, being 60 years and half a world removed from anyone who would eventually conduct it, separated from that distant research by centuries, and an ocean and a language nobody in Veludvara had ever heard spoken. But standing at the gate stones that morning, closing a wound her own family had carried unspoken for 2 generations, she understood something that study would later spend decades and enormous resources proving with careful numbers and long tables of data. That a life spent guarding against strangers is not, in fact, the safer life. However much it might feel that way in the moment of guarding, it is only the smaller one, the more isolated one, the one that trades genuine safety for the mere appearance of it. If there's someone in your own life you've been meaning to walk toward, not because you're certain it'll go well, not because you have any guarantee at all about how it will land, just because enough time has passed, and the not walking has started to cost more than the walking ever could, has become its own quiet accumulating burden. This might be the nudge you've been waiting for. Who comes to mind? Tell me below, even just their name, even if that's all you're ready to say right now. Chapter 12. Mahanama at the fire Vadamata's walk to the gate had opened it. What happened next was not instant, and it was not easy, but it was real. The way things earned slowly tend to be more real than things that arrive all at once. Then a sudden conversion that vanishes as quickly as it came. By midday, the field beyond the gate stones had become, without anyone officially declaring it so, part of the village again, or the village had become, quietly, part of the field, the old boundary softening not through any formal decision, but through dozens of small, individual choices made throughout the morning, by villagers who had watched Vadamata's walk and found, in her example, a kind of permission they hadn't known they were waiting for. A handful of villagers had followed her lead in small, tentative ways, bringing water they didn't strictly have to bring, carrying it the extra distance past the stones, with a shyness that suggested they weren't entirely sure this was allowed even now. Sitting near enough to listen without committing to anything more than listening, perched at a careful, non-committal distance that still represented, for most of them, a genuine crossing of some internal line. The ordinary, undramatic mechanics of a boundary slowly becoming less of one small gesture at a time. Mahanama watched all of this from a distance for most of the morning, the way he'd watched everything for the past 2 days. Close enough to see, far enough to maintain some remaining fiction of the line he'd drawn, standing at the edge of his own authority and watching it dissolve, piece by piece, without quite being able to bring himself to stop it. But something had shifted in him overnight, cracked open by the sight of Pandaka, accepting water without flinching, widened further by watching Vadamata do something he himself hadn't managed in 30 years of being the village's most careful man. A woman decades older than him, finding a courage he'd spent 3 decades carefully avoiding. He crossed to the fire alone, in the early afternoon, without announcing it to anyone, without his wife or son beside him for support, without Bagu's counsel either sought or offered, walking the distance with the deliberate, slightly stiff gait of a man forcing his body to do something his mind had only just barely decided to permit. Just Mahanama, walking the short distance from inside the gate stones to the small fire where the wanderer sat, a distance that had taken him, in every way that mattered, 30 years to cross, 30 years of accumulated caution finally giving way, in the space of a single afternoon, to something he couldn't yet fully name. The wanderer looked up as he approached but didn't rise, didn't make anything ceremonial of the moment, simply made room the way he seemed to make room for everyone, shifting slightly on the ground to indicate a place Mahanama might sit. "You're the headman," the wanderer said. "Not a question, I am." Mahanama sat stiffly, unused to sitting on bare ground in front of anyone, especially not in front of a man he'd spent 2 days deliberately keeping at arm's length. "I told my people you weren't to come inside the stones. I meant it as caution. I think now it was mostly something else. Fear usually wears caution's clothes," the wanderer said, without any particular judgment in his tone, simply stating a fact he'd apparently observed many times before, in many other villages, from many other careful men. "It's a comfortable disguise. Nobody has to admit to being afraid if they can call it prudent instead, if they can dress it up in the language of good sense and careful leadership." Mahanama was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, it came out of him in a rush, the way 30-year-old shame sometimes does. The first crack finally lets it through, the whole dam of careful restraint, giving way all at once after decades of holding steady. He told the whole of it, his father, the old warning ignored, the harvest that failed exactly as predicted, the slow public unraveling of a man standing that 9-year-old Mahanama had watched happen, and had spent every year since trying to make sure never happened to him. The particular, specific fear of being wrong out loud that had shaped every cautious decision of his adult life, without his ever quite naming it, even to himself, until this exact moment. This is the moment everything changes. Though it didn't look like much from the outside, just a headman sitting on bare ground, talking, and a wanderer, listening, without interrupting, without rushing him toward any particular conclusion, without offering easy reassurance before Mahanama had finished saying what needed after 30 years to finally be said. I built my whole life, Mahanama said finally, around never being wrong out loud, in front of my own people. I didn't even know that's what I was doing most days. I just called it being careful, called it good leadership, told myself I was protecting the village when really, I think, I was mostly protecting myself from ever standing where my father stood. And has it worked? The wanderer asked gently. Not accusingly, the question offered with genuine curiosity rather than any hint of judgment. Mahanama thought about it honestly. For what felt like the first time in years, turning the question over with a care he hadn't given it before, having always been too busy simply living inside the strategy to actually examine whether the strategy had delivered what it promised. It's kept me from ever being humiliated the way my father was, he said slowly. It's also kept me from ever fully belonging to my own village the way he did. Before that year, before everything went wrong. People respect me. I'm not sure many of them love me the way they loved him. Even after everything, even after the harvest and the years of quiet jokes and sideways looks. There's a difference, I'm realizing, between being obeyed and being trusted, and I think I only ever managed the first one. The wanderer nodded, as if this were an old and familiar shape of suffering, which, in its way it was, a pattern he had likely encountered in some form in nearly every village he'd ever passed through. The self you built out of your father's shame, he said, isn't the only self available to you. It only feels permanent because you've been standing inside it for 30 years without stepping outside to look at it directly, without ever once questioning whether the architecture you built at 9 years old still serves the man you've become. It's worth noticing, a wound doesn't have to define the shape of everything built around it forever. It can be an old wound, tended and understood, rather than the architecture of an entire life, a scar you carry rather than a cage you live inside. Something in Mahanama, hearing this, felt less like being told something new, and more like finally having permission to stop pretending he didn't already, somewhere, know it. A truth he'd perhaps sensed for years without ever having the words or the safety to say it aloud. Nearby at the same fire, though at a respectful distance, Kutika had arrived separately, drawn by nothing more specific than restlessness, and the pull of a place that had, in the space of a day, stopped feeling like forbidden ground. He didn't speak with the wanderer directly, didn't feel, yet, that he had anything urgent enough to say, content simply to be present in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be for weeks. He simply sat near the fire's edge and found, to his mild surprise, a kind of peace settling into him that had nothing to do with the debt actually being solved. The field might still go to Megara by week's end. That hadn't changed, wouldn't change simply because he'd finally spoken the number aloud, or because he now sat near a stranger's fire. But the weight of carrying it entirely alone had changed, and it turned out that had been most of the weight all along, the actual debt itself smaller, somehow, than the loneliness of carrying it in silence had been. Megara himself came later that afternoon, more cautiously than either Mahanama or Kutika, still uncertain what exactly had drawn him across the field, some pull he couldn't quite name or explain even to himself. He didn't unburden himself the way Mahanama had, didn't offer any confession about his grandfather's ruin or his own lifelong hunger for security. He simply sat and listened to a stretch of quiet teaching about the nature of wanting more. Not a lecture aimed at him specifically, just words that happened to land somewhere. True in a man who had spent his whole life collecting safety and never quite feeling it arrive, no matter how much he accumulated. Tangha, named plainly, without cruelty, without singling anyone out, just an honest description of a hunger that never fully satisfies itself, no matter how much it's fed. A description that Megara, sitting quietly at the edge of the gathering, recognized in himself with an uncomfortable clarity he hadn't expected. Megara didn't announce any change of heart. He simply sat a while longer than he'd planned to, and walked home slower than usual, turning something over that he wasn't yet ready to examine too closely. Bagu arrived last, and stayed shortest and said the least, but he came, which was itself the whole of what mattered. A small act of humility from a man whose entire authority had been built on never appearing uncertain. His authority in the village wasn't destroyed by any of this, as he'd feared it might be back when he'd first argued Mahanama toward caution. It was, if anything, quietly widened. A priest who had been humble enough to walk to the gate himself, rather than simply issuing warnings from a safe distance, found himself trusted in a slightly different, sturdier way than before, respected now for something closer to honesty than for the careful performance of certainty he'd maintained for 20 years. Yasa arrived at the fire late in the afternoon, after his father, working up his own courage in a slower, more hesitant way than Mahanama had managed, having spent most of the day watching from a distance the way he'd watched everything these past several days. He didn't sit near his father when he finally crossed the field. Some old habit of deference kept a respectful distance between them even here. But he sat close enough to hear some of what was being said, close enough that when the wanderer glanced his way once, briefly, Yasa felt seen in a manner that had nothing to do with his father's position or his own place in the family line. He didn't speak that day either. But walking home beside his father in the early evening, the first time in longer than either of them could remember that they'd walked anywhere together without an errand attached to the walking, Yasa found himself saying quietly, "I'm glad you went." Mahanama, startled by the small, direct kindness of it, coming from a son he'd spent years managing rather than actually knowing, didn't have a ready answer. He simply nodded, and the two of them walked the rest of the way in a silence that felt, for the first time in a long while, less like distance and more like company. Mahanama, walking the rest of the way home in that new, easier silence beside his son, found himself thinking that this, an ordinary walk, an ordinary evening, a single small sentence offered without any particular fanfare, might turn out to matter more, in the long accounting of his life, than 30 years of carefully avoided humiliation ever had. This is not a story that ends with everyone in Veludvara becoming a monk, abandoning their fields and their families for a wandering life none of them had ever actually wanted. This is not a story that ends with the drought suddenly breaking, the sky opening generously the very next morning, as if the universe were rewarding good behavior with an obliging, tidy miracle. This is not a story where fear never comes back. Fear always comes back, in villages and in people both. It's simply part of what it means to be a creature capable of loving anything enough to be afraid of losing it, capable of caring enough about belonging to feel the sting of its absence. This is a story about a village that, for one particular night and the days around it, chose to be a little less afraid of each other than it had been the week before. A small, real incomplete shift that would need tending, like anything worth growing, for a long time yet to come. Late that afternoon, Nanda finally reached the last stretch of road home, having found a way across the flooded crossing after all, wetter and later than planned but whole, exhausted in the particular way that comes only from a genuinely hard journey nearly at its end. He walked into a village that looked, on the surface, exactly as he'd left it. Same huts, same fields, same gate stones standing where they'd always stood. But something in the air was different. Something he couldn't quite name yet. And it took him a little while, gathering the story in pieces from his wife and children and neighbors. Everyone eager to be the one who told him, to understand what exactly had happened in his 11 days away. Sujata met him at their door with both children clinging to her skirts, and the relief on her face at seeing him whole was quickly followed by an eagerness to tell him everything he'd missed. The wanderer, the gate, Vadamata's walk across the field, Mahanama at the fire, the whole tangled, remarkable week compressed into a breathless, overlapping account that Nanda struggled to fully follow, even as he pulled his children close and felt, for the first time in 11 days, the particular relief of simply being home. Nanda listened, tired from the road and a little overwhelmed by the sheer amount of change packed into 11 days, and found himself by the end of it simply glad to be home, welcomed into a story he hadn't witnessed firsthand, but that had somehow already made room for him too, a small human grace note at the edge of a much larger transformation. Chapter 13. What the gate remembers now that night. Veludvara slept differently than it had in months, a quality to the quiet that felt, to anyone paying attention, distinctly unlike the tense, watchful stillness of the past 3 months of drought. Tissa and Nandini were asleep near the field itself, close to their mother, close to the dying fire where the monks' camp had settled into its quiet evening rhythm. The same chanting Pandaka had heard the night before, though tonight he wasn't listening from a careful distance. He was sitting near enough to feel the fire's warmth. No longer a man past the boundary stones, but simply a man among others, at the edge of a field on an ordinary night, his torn cloth finally mended, folded neatly beside him, a small, unremarkable symbol of a life that had, in the space of 2 days, quietly begun to rejoin the rest of the villages. Vadamata sat a little apart, watching the fire settle into embers, Sona dozing against her shoulder, the girl's earlier restlessness finally spent by a day that had asked more of her than any single day usually asked of a 15-year-old. The old woman felt something in her chest that had been tight for 60 years finally, fully at rest, not because anything about the original story had changed, not because the past could be rewritten by any present kindness however genuine. Her grandmother had still turned a stranger away once long ago. That fact would always be true, unchangeable. A real weight in the family's history that no amount of present-day welcome could erase. But it no longer sat in Vadamata alone, unfinished, waiting for some resolution that might never come. It had been carried the rest of the way, and set down, the way a heavy load is finally set down at the end of a very long walk. Sujata, walking back to her own hut, with a sleepy Tissa's hand in hers, and Nandini already asleep against Nanda's shoulder, passed close enough to Vadamata's fire to catch the old woman's eye, and the two women exchanged a small, tired, genuine smile, the particular smile of two people who had each, in their own separate ways, carried something heavy through this particular week, and were both tonight finally allowed to set some part of it down. "Your husband made it home," Vadamata said, more an observation than a question. "He did." Sujata glanced back at Nanda, who was murmuring something to Tissa about the walk home, some ordinary fatherly nonsense that made their son laugh quietly in the dark. "I don't think he fully understands yet what happened while he was gone. I'm not sure I fully understand it either, if I'm honest." "None of us do yet," Vadamata said. "I'm not sure understanding it is really the point tonight. Some things you live your way into understanding, slowly, long after the night itself has passed." Sujata nodded and continued on toward her own hut. Her family gathered close around her in the dark, carrying home with her a version of the same quiet, unfinished peace that had settled, that particular night over most of Veludvara. Not a resolution exactly, but something almost as good. The simple, ordinary relief of a village that had, for once, chosen to be a little kinder to itself than it had to be. Mahanama walked the boundary of the village once more before turning in for the night, the way he did most evenings, a habit of careful vigilance 30 years in the making. Though tonight the walk felt different under his feet, lighter somehow, less like patrolling a threat, and more like simply enjoying the cool night air. He passed close enough to the field to see the small fire still glowing. The shapes of villagers and monks settled easily near each other in a way that would have seemed impossible just 2 days before. A scene that, had someone described it to him a week ago, he would have dismissed as naive fantasy. He didn't stop. He didn't need to tonight. He simply noted quietly that the gate stones behind him no longer felt like a line he was defending, a wall he needed to maintain against some vague inherited threat, but simply like 2 old stones, worn smooth by generations of feet, marking a place where one thing became another, a threshold rather than a barrier. There's an old line from a teaching that would echo for centuries after this particular night, in this particular forgotten village, about what it actually means to live well among people who are still, in their own ways, afraid. Happy indeed we live, free from hatred among the hateful, among people consumed by fear to live without fear ourselves. It isn't a promise that the fear around you disappears, isn't a guarantee that the world will stop offering you reasons to be afraid. It's a description of what becomes possible anyway. Even while it doesn't, a way of living that doesn't depend on the world first becoming safe before you allow yourself to stop guarding against it quite so completely. Veludvara hadn't stopped being afraid, not entirely, not all at once, the way a single dramatic night could never fully undo 30 years of inherited caution or 2 generations of unspoken shame. The drought hadn't broken. The sky above the village remained, that particular evening, exactly as grey and unpromising as it had been for 3 months running. Kutika's debt hadn't vanished, and the back field would very likely still go to Megara by week's end. A hard practical reality that no amount of shared firelight could dissolve. Megara was still, in most of the ways that mattered, the same careful, guarded man he'd been the week before, his ledgers waiting for him at home, his old family scripture about ruin and carelessness still humming somewhere in the back of his mind. Change like this doesn't announce itself with trumpets, doesn't arrive as a single, complete transformation. It just moves quietly through a place, one small crossing at a time, until enough people have crossed that the place itself is different, even if no single dramatic moment marks exactly when, even if the change examined too closely might seem almost too small and too gradual to name at all. If you want to carry 3 things from this particular night, in this particular forgotten village, let them be these. First, welcome. In the plainest teaching the wanderer ever gave to villages just like this one, was never about grand belief arriving all at once, was never a matter of conversion or ceremony. It was measured by something much simpler, whether you'd want the same kindness done to you, if you were the one standing at someone else's gate, tired, afraid, asking only for water, and nothing more than that. Second, the fear that quietly runs a life, the way it ran Mahanama's for 30 years, dressed up as caution, as prudence, as simply being careful, as good responsible leadership, nearly always traces back to one old wound that was never given the chance to be spoken, tended, and set down properly. Yours might be older than you think, might be quieter than Mahanama's, might never have announced itself as clearly as his did at 9 years old beside his father at a different gate. It might be smaller than you've built it up to be, in your own head, over the years of carrying it alone. And third, the part that matters most, the part worth carrying past everything else in this story, somewhere in your own life, tonight, There is very likely a gate only you can walk through. No one is going to make you do it. No wanderer is going to arrive on your road and change everything for you in a single conversation. However much you might wish some nights that someone would, it will probably look, from the outside, as ordinary as an old woman walking across a field, or a headman sitting down on bare ground, or a sick man taking one slow step toward a sound in the dark. But it is very often exactly that ordinary, and exactly that available. Whenever you're finally ready, whenever the weight of not walking finally outgrows whatever fear has kept you standing still. If tonight is the night you finally rest easy, if some part of this story found its way into the part of you that's been carrying something too long alone, tell me one thing, even just one word, that you're ready to set down. Somewhere in the dark beyond the field, the forest held its old, patient quiet, indifferent to villages and wanderers and gate stones alike, the way forests always are. And somewhere further still, the sky that had refused Veludvara rain for 3 months continued to hold whatever it was holding, giving no sign, that particular night, of when it might finally choose to let go. The fire in the field beyond Veludvara's gate burned low, and then lower, and then, sometime past midnight, settled into embers that would still be warm. Come morning, a small, steady warmth outlasting the conversations and the crossings and the long day's worth of quiet courage that had brought the village to this particular rest. The village slept. The forest held its usual quiet. And somewhere past the 2 old stones that had stood there longer than anyone could remember. A village that hadn't been ready and had welcomed a stranger anyway, finally, gently, let itself rest.